Daddy, why don't I have a mommy like everyone else?
The question hit Dan Carter like a punch to the chest as he knelt beside his 8-year-old daughter Sophie in the elementary school auditorium. Around them, families clustered together after the spring concert, mothers adjusting costume pieces and fathers taking photos. The easy unity of complete families that made Dan acutely aware of what he and Sophie lacked. Sophie's auburn hair was still crowned with the flower headpiece from her performance as a daisy in the school's garden production, but her brown eyes held the kind of sadness that no 8-year-old should have to carry. Dan pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and struggling to find words that could ease a pain he felt just as deeply. It's not that you don't have a mommy, sweetheart. Your mommy just can't be here with us anymore, but she loves you more than all the stars in the sky. I know, Sophie whispered, leaning into his embrace. But Jenny's mummy helped her with her costume, and Marcus's mummy made cupcakes for everyone, and I just wished I had a mummy here too. Dan's throat tightened as he watched other families around them, seeing what Sophie saw. The easy collaboration between parents, the way mothers naturally smoothed children's hair, and fathers captured moments with cameras, the casual intimacy of partnerships that made raising children feel less overwhelming. For 2 years since his wife Rebecca had died in a car accident, Dan had been both mother and father to Sophie, attending every school event alone, handling every milestone without a partner to share the joy or divide the responsibility. Some days he felt like he was drowning in the magnitude of raising a child alone, but he'd learned to hide that exhaustion behind a competent smile that fooled everyone except himself. "Tell you what," Dan said, forcing lightness into his voice. "How about we stop for ice cream on the way home, and you can tell me all about the best parts of tonight's show?" Sophie managed a small smile, but Dan could see the loneliness lingering in her eyes as they gathered her backpack and headed toward the parking lot. In the car, she chatted about her performance and her friends' costumes, but Dan caught her glancing wistfully at families walking together toward their cars, complete units that made their family of 2 feel somehow insufficient. That night, after Sophie was finally asleep, Dan sat at his kitchen table staring at bills that seemed to multiply despite his careful budgeting. His salary as a senior marketing coordinator at Blackwell Communications was decent, but single parenthood came with expenses that 2-parent families shared: daycare costs, after-school programs, the babysitters he hired for evening work events that were increasingly important for his career advancement. Dan pulled out his phone, intending to update his calendar with the weekend soccer schedule, when his thumb accidentally brushed against Rebecca's name in his contacts. He'd kept her number for 2 years, unable to delete that final connection to the woman who'd been his partner in everything. Before he could stop himself, grief and exhaustion and the weight of Sophie's question overwhelmed his usual careful control. His fingers moved across the screen, typing words he'd never intended to send anywhere. "I miss you so much I can barely breathe some days." Sophie asked about not having a mommy tonight, and I didn't know what to say. I'm trying to be enough for her, but I feel like I'm failing every single day. I'm so tired and lonely and scared that I'm not giving her what she needs. I wish you were here to help me know what to do. Dan's vision blurred as he typed, the phone screen swimming through tears he'd held back all evening. Without thinking, without checking, consumed by the kind of exhaustion that made rational thought impossible, he hit send. The message went not to Rebecca's long disconnected number, but to the contact directly below it in his phone. Victoria Blackwell, his boss, the CEO of the company where he'd worked for 3 years, the woman known throughout the office as brilliant, demanding, and utterly professional. Victoria Blackwell, who arrived at work before anyone else and left after everyone had gone home. Victoria Blackwell, who ran client meetings with surgical precision and had never, in Dan's experience, shown any interest in the personal lives of her employees. Victoria Blackwell, who had just received the most private, vulnerable message Dan had ever written. Dan realized his mistake 30 seconds too late. The message showed as delivered, and the horror of what he'd accidentally shared with his boss hit him like ice water. He stared at his phone in disbelief, his heart racing as he processed the magnitude of his error. He'd just sent an emotional breakdown to the Ice Queen of Blackwell Communications, a woman who terrified new employees and conducted business with the kind of cold efficiency that had built her company's reputation. She would think he was unprofessional, unstable, completely inappropriate. She could fire him. She should fire him. Dan set his phone aside and buried his face in his hands, wondering if it was possible to die from embarrassment. Tomorrow he would have to face Victoria in meetings, pretend this catastrophic overshare had never happened, and hope she had the professional courtesy to ignore the message entirely. What Dan didn't know was that Victoria Blackwell was sitting in her own kitchen at 11:47 p.m., staring at his message with tears streaming down her face. Victoria had built her reputation on control, on the kind of emotional distance that allowed her to make difficult business decisions without being swayed by personal feelings. At 38, she was one of the youngest CEOs in the marketing industry, a success story that magazines loved to profile and competitors loved to hate. What those articles never mentioned was the cost of that success, the complete isolation, the sacrifice of personal relationships for professional advancement, the way she'd learned to armor herself against any vulnerability that might be perceived as weakness in the corporate world. She'd been married once, to James Blackwell, a military officer who'd been killed in Afghanistan 4 years earlier. His death had nearly destroyed her, but she'd channeled that grief into work, building Blackwell Communications into one of the most respected agencies on the West Coast, while carefully ensuring that no one saw the broken woman behind the professional facade. Victoria had no close friends, no family nearby, no life outside the office that provided meaning or connection. She worked 16-hour days because the alternative was going home to an empty apartment that echoed with loneliness she'd trained herself not to acknowledge. Reading Dan's accidental message felt like looking through a window into the kind of authentic emotion she'd spent 4 years avoiding. Here was raw grief, honest fear, the vulnerability of a parent trying to do right by his child while struggling with loss that mirrored her own hidden pain. Dan Carter. She knew him as a talented designer who never missed deadlines, who handled client challenges with creativity and grace, who'd never given her reason to question his professional competence. She'd noticed he never attended office happy hours, never participated in workplace social events, but she'd assumed he simply preferred to maintain boundaries between work and personal life. Now she understood that he was protecting the same kind of wounds she carried, navigating grief while maintaining the appearance of competent functionality that professional life demanded. Victoria read his message 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of pain that resonated with her own carefully buried emotions. A widowed father raising his daughter alone, questioning whether he was enough, missing his partner with the kind of desperate intensity that Victoria recognized from her own darkest nights. She should ignore this. She should pretend the message never happened, maintain professional distance, protect both of them from the complications of personal connection in a workplace that demanded clear boundaries. Instead, Victoria found herself typing a response. Dan, I'm so sorry for your loss and for the pain you're carrying. Raising a child alone after losing a partner takes incredible strength, and from what I observe, you're doing a remarkable job. Sophie is lucky to have a father who cares so deeply about her well-being. If you ever need someone to talk to who understands loss, I'm here. Victoria stared at her own message, surprised by the words that had appeared on her screen. She'd revealed nothing specific about her own circumstances, but she'd offered something she'd never given any employee: genuine personal support. Before she could reconsider, she sent the message. Dan's phone buzzed at 12:03 a.m. He'd been lying awake, staring at the ceiling, and planning how to handle the inevitable awkwardness of Monday morning, when Victoria's response appeared. He read it twice, hardly believing that the Ice Queen had not only responded with kindness, but had hinted at understanding loss from personal experience. The relief was overwhelming. She wasn't angry, wasn't planning to fire him, had somehow found compassion for his accidentally shared vulnerability. "Thank you," he typed back. "That means more than you could possibly know. I'm mortified that I sent that to you by mistake, but grateful you responded with such kindness." Victoria's response came quickly. "Don't be embarrassed. We all carry more than others see. Take care of yourself and Sophie." The brief exchange ended there, but something had shifted between them. Victoria fell asleep thinking about single parenthood and the courage it took to show up for a child's needs while nursing private grief. Dan slept better than he had in weeks, comforted by the unexpected connection with someone who'd offered understanding instead of judgment. Saturday morning brought the kind of Seattle drizzle that made indoor activities seem appealing. Dan was attempting to help Sophie with a science project about the solar system when their doorbell rang at 9:30 a.m. He opened the door to find Victoria Blackwell standing on his front porch, looking nothing like the intimidating CEO who commanded boardrooms with icy precision. She wore jeans and a soft cream sweater, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in its usual severe chignon, and she was holding 2 coffee cups from the local coffee shop. "I brought coffee," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it at work. "And I was hoping to meet Sophie, and maybe help with whatever project has you both looking so frustrated through your front window." Dan stared at her, processing the surreal image of his boss standing casually on his doorstep on a Saturday morning, looking younger and more approachable than he'd thought possible. "You came here," he said, still not quite believing it. "I did?" Victoria said, a hint of uncertainty creeping into her voice. "If this is inappropriate, I can leave. I just thought you might need a friend today, and I have a PhD in astrophysics that's been gathering dust for 15 years. Before Dan could respond, Sophie appeared behind him, curious about the visitor. She looked up at Victoria with the frank assessment of an 8-year-old, taking in the blonde hair and kind eyes and coffee offerings. "Are you here to help with my Saturn project?" Sophie asked hopefully. "Because Daddy's been trying to make the rings stay up for like an hour and they keep falling down." Victoria smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face from professionally intimidating to genuinely warm. "I would love to help with your Saturn project. I used to study planets for a living, so I might know a few tricks about ring construction." Within minutes, Victoria was sitting cross-legged on Dan's living room floor, showing Sophie how to use wire and cotton balls to create stable planetary rings while explaining the actual composition of Saturn's ring system with enthusiasm that had Sophie completely captivated. "This is so much better than what Daddy was trying to do," Sophie declared, carefully positioning cotton balls along the wire framework Victoria had demonstrated. Dan watched from the kitchen doorway, marveling at the transformation in both his boss and his daughter. Victoria was patient and encouraging, treating Sophie's questions with the same seriousness she brought to million-dollar client presentations. Sophie was more animated than he'd seen her since Rebecca's death, lighting up under the attention of someone who clearly knew far more about space than her elementary school textbooks covered. "I can't believe you actually came here," Dan said when Victoria joined him in the kitchen for fresh coffee. Victoria's professional mask flickered back into place for a moment. "Was it wrong of me? I know it's unusual, but your message last night..." She paused, struggling with vulnerability that came naturally in work settings. I understood the loneliness you described. I thought maybe you could use some practical support instead of just sympathy. Dan studied her face, seeing past the carefully maintained composure to something that looked like hope. When was the last time you spent a Saturday morning helping with someone's homework? Victoria was quiet for a long moment. I can't remember, she admitted. When was the last time someone needed my help with something that actually mattered? The honesty in her voice made Dan's chest tighten with recognition. They were both isolated in different ways, both going through the motions of successful lives while missing the connections that made those successes meaningful. Well, Dan said gently, Sophie definitely needs help finishing that project, and I'm pretty sure she'd adopt you permanently if you're willing to explain how Jupiter's moons work. Victoria's smile was radiant. I'd like that. I'd like that very much. They spent the morning working on Sophie's solar system model, with Victoria patiently explaining planetary characteristics, while Dan contributed artistic skills to painting and construction. For the first time since Rebecca's death, Dan felt like they were functioning as a team, with someone else naturally sharing the load of parenting responsibilities. Sophie basked in the attention of two adults focused entirely on her project, asking increasingly complex questions about space exploration and gravitational forces that Victoria answered with obvious delight. By lunchtime, they'd created a solar system model that was definitely going to impress Sophie's teacher, and more importantly, they'd created something else, the tentative beginning of an unlikely friendship. Would you like to stay for lunch? Dan asked as they cleaned up construction materials. It's just grilled cheese sandwiches, but Sophie makes excellent chocolate milk to go with them. Victoria hesitated, clearly torn between professional caution and personal desire. I should probably go. This is already more personal involvement than I typically allow myself with employees. But you're not just my boss today, Dan said quietly. Today you're Sophie's friend who knows about planets, and my friend who understood why I needed help. If you want to stay just for lunch, that would be nice. Victoria looked at Sophie, who was carefully arranging her completed project for optimal display, her face bright with accomplishment and joy. Just for lunch, Victoria said finally. But I make the chocolate milk. Sophie's technique probably needs some improvement. Lunch was everything Dan had forgotten family meals could be. Easy conversation, laughter, the comfortable chaos of a child chattering about everything and nothing while adults listened with genuine interest. Victoria seemed to relax completely, asking Sophie about school and friends and favorite books with the kind of attention that made an 8-year-old feel genuinely heard. Miss Victoria, Sophie said as they finished eating, do you have any kids? Victoria's expression flickered with something painful. No, sweetheart, I don't have children. Why not? Sophie asked with childhood's innocent directness. Dan started to intervene, but Victoria answered honestly. I was married once, but my husband died before we had children. After that, I was too sad for a long time to think about families. Sophie considered this seriously. That's really sad. But you're good with kids. You should get some. Victoria laughed despite the tears threatening her composure. It's not quite that simple, but thank you for the recommendation. You could borrow me sometimes. Sophie offered generously. If you want to practice being a mum, Daddy says I'm very good at helping people practice things. The generous offer made Victoria's throat tighten with emotion. She looked at this confident, loving child who'd just offered to share herself with someone she'd known for 3 hours, and felt something crack open in her chest. That's the nicest offer anyone has ever made me, Victoria said quietly. I would be honored to practice with you. As Victoria prepared to leave that afternoon, Sophie hugged her goodbye with the uninhibited affection of childhood, and Dan felt something shift in his understanding of his life's possibilities. Thank you, he said quietly as Victoria gathered her purse. For coming, for helping, for being exactly what we needed today. Thank you for letting me stay. Victoria replied, I haven't felt this useful or this happy in years. As Victoria drove away from Dan's modest house, she felt like she was leaving something precious behind. The afternoon had reminded her of what she'd sacrificed for professional success, the simple joy of being needed, of contributing to someone's daily happiness, of connecting with people who saw her as more than just her job title. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be valued for kindness rather than competence, to spend time without agenda or deadline, to be part of something that mattered more than quarterly profits. That night, as Dan tucked Sophie into bed, his daughter's enthusiasm about their day bubbled over into planning. Daddy, can Miss Victoria come back next weekend? She knows so much cool stuff, and she didn't get upset when I spilled chocolate milk on her sweater. Maybe, sweetheart. But remember, Miss Victoria is very busy with her work, but she said she liked practicing being a mum with me. And you smiled more today than you have in forever. Sophie's observation hit Dan with unexpected force. He had smiled more that day, had felt lighter and more hopeful than he'd felt since Rebecca's death. Victoria's presence had created something he'd forgotten was possible, the sense that he wasn't carrying every responsibility alone. We'll see what happens, he told Sophie. But today was pretty special, wasn't it? The best Saturday ever, Sophie declared with 8-year-old certainty. Miss Victoria is magic. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. Part 2. Walls Come Down. Sunday morning arrived with the typical chaos of single parenthood. Sophie's soccer game at 10 a.m., grocery shopping that couldn't be postponed any longer, and the mountain of laundry that had somehow multiplied overnight. Dan was rushing to pack snacks and water bottles when his phone buzzed with a text message. Victoria, good morning. I hope Sophie's Saturn project gets the A+ it deserves tomorrow. Thank you again for yesterday. Dan smiled as he typed back. Thank you for making it possible. She's been telling everyone who will listen about her new friend who knows about space. Victoria's response came quickly. Would it be inappropriate if I asked how the soccer game goes? I've never been to a child's sporting event. Dan stared at his phone, processing the implications of his boss showing interest in his daughter's weekend activities. The professional part of his brain recognized the boundary crossing, but the lonely parent part appreciated someone caring about the small details that made up his life. She's playing at Miller Park at 10 if you're curious, he typed, then added quickly. No pressure. Just thought you might want to know. He didn't expect Victoria to actually show up, which is why he was shocked to see her standing near the sidelines 20 minutes into Sophie's game, wearing jeans and sneakers and looking slightly out of place among the other parents, but unmistakably present. Sophie spotted Victoria during halftime and waved enthusiastically, her face bright with delight that her new friend had come to watch her play. For the rest of the game, Sophie played with extra energy, clearly performing for her audience of 2. After the game, which Sophie's team won 3-2, Sophie ran straight to Victoria for a congratulatory hug that Victoria accepted with surprising naturalness. Did you see my goal in the second half? Sophie bubbled with excitement. I remembered what Coach Sarah taught us about aiming for the corners. I saw it, Victoria said warmly. It was an amazing goal. You're really talented. Dan approached them feeling grateful and slightly overwhelmed by Victoria's presence in their weekend routine. You came, he said simply. Victoria looked almost embarrassed. I hope that's okay. I was curious, and I didn't have any other plans. The admission that Victoria had no weekend plans struck Dan as profoundly sad. Here was a successful, intelligent woman spending Saturday mornings alone while he struggled to manage single parenthood. Maybe they could help each other in ways that went beyond professional support. We were going to grab lunch after this, Dan said carefully. Just burgers and fries. Nothing fancy. Would you like to join us? Victoria hesitated, the professional caution warring with personal desire that Dan was beginning to recognize as her default internal conflict. Please, Miss Victoria. Sophie chimed in. Daddy always lets me get milkshakes on game days, and you said you make the best chocolate milk, so you probably know about good milkshakes too. Victoria's resistance crumbled under Sophie's hopeful expression. Okay, she said, her smile genuine and unguarded. But I'm buying lunch as a celebration of your winning goal. The restaurant was a family-friendly place with checkered tablecloths and a menu that hadn't changed in 20 years. Victoria looked slightly out of place among the soccer families and crying toddlers, but she seemed determined to embrace the chaos rather than retreat from it. Sophie monopolized most of the conversation, regaling Victoria with detailed accounts of each play in the game and elaborate plans for improving her performance next week. Victoria listened with the kind of attention that made Sophie glow with importance, asking follow-up questions and offering encouragement with genuine enthusiasm. Watching them interact, Dan felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since Rebecca's death. Sophie was responding to Victoria's attention like a flower to sunlight, and Victoria seemed to be rediscovering a side of herself that her professional life had buried. Miss Victoria, Sophie said seriously as they waited for dessert. Can I ask you something personal? Of course, sweetheart. Were you married to a soldier like in the movies? Is that how your husband died? Dan tensed, ready to redirect Sophie's innocent but potentially painful question. But Victoria answered with quiet honesty. Yes, I was married to a soldier. His name was James, and he was very brave and kind. He died in Afghanistan 4 years ago, fighting to help people who needed protection. Sophie absorbed this information with 8-year-old solemnity. That's really brave, but really sad. Do you miss him? Every day, Victoria said simply. Just like your daddy misses your mummy. Do you think they know each other now? Sophie asked, her child's mind working to make sense of loss and memory. Like, do you think they're friends in heaven, or wherever people go when they die? Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. I think they would like each other very much. Your mummy sounds like she was an amazing mother, and James always said he wanted children someday. They probably would be friends. Sophie nodded with satisfaction, as if Victoria's answer had resolved something important in her understanding of the world. Then you're both alone like we are. That's kind of sad, but also kind of nice, because now we can all be together sometimes. The simple wisdom of the observation left both adults speechless for a moment. From Sophie's perspective, their shared losses created opportunity for shared healing, their individual loneliness combining into collective comfort. After lunch, they ended up at the park where Dan and Sophie usually spent Sunday afternoons. Victoria kicked off her sneakers and joined Sophie on the swings, laughing with genuine delight as Sophie challenged her to swing higher and jump farther. Dan sat on a bench watching Victoria discover the simple joy of playground equipment, marveling at the transformation from intimidating CEO to someone giggling with his daughter over who could swing highest. When did you last do this? Dan called out. Probably when I was Sophie's age. Victoria replied, pumping her legs to gain height on the swing. I'd forgotten how wonderful it feels to fly. Watching Victoria embrace childish pleasure with such obvious joy, Dan felt his perspective on their growing friendship shift into something more complex. This wasn't just professional courtesy or even simple friendship developing between them. Victoria was becoming important to Sophie in ways that went beyond occasional help with science projects. More concerning, Dan was beginning to look forward to Victoria's presence in ways that had nothing to do with parenting support and everything to do with the way she made him feel less alone in the world. As the afternoon wound down and they prepared to leave the park, Sophie made an announcement that surprised both adults. "Miss Victoria, you should come to dinner at Grandma Helen's house next Sunday. She makes the best roast chicken ever, and she's been wanting to meet you." Dan's heart stopped. Helen Morrison was Rebecca's mother, the woman who'd been his lifeline during the worst period of his grief, Sophie's primary grandmother figure and the keeper of Rebecca's memory in their family structure. "Sophie," Dan said quickly, "Miss Victoria is probably busy next Sunday." But Victoria was studying Sophie's hopeful face with an expression that looked like longing mixed with fear. "Who's Grandma Helen?" she asked gently. "She's my real grandma from my mummy who died," Sophie explained matter-of-factly. "She loves me and Daddy so much, and she makes really good food, and she tells the best stories about when my mummy was little like me." Victoria looked at Dan, clearly understanding the significance of the invitation and the complexity of meeting the woman who represented Rebecca's family. "That sounds lovely," Victoria said carefully, "but I think that's something special between you, your daddy, and Grandma Helen. I wouldn't want to intrude on family time, but Daddy's always sad after we visit Grandma Helen," Sophie said with 8-year-old perception that cut straight to the heart of things. "Maybe if you were there too, he wouldn't be so sad afterward." The observation hit Dan like a physical blow. He'd thought he was hiding his post-visit melancholy from Sophie, but apparently 8-year-olds were more perceptive than he'd given them credit for. "Sophie," Dan said gently, "Miss Victoria has her own life and her own plans. We can't just invite people to Grandma Helen's house without asking her first." "Actually," Helen's voice came from behind them, "I think it's a wonderful idea." They all turned to see Helen Morrison approaching across the park, her grey hair catching the afternoon light, and her face wearing the kind of knowing smile that suggested she'd been observing them for several minutes. "Helen," Dan said, feeling heat creep up his neck. "I didn't know you were here. I was visiting the Andersons just across the street and saw you all playing together." Helen's eyes moved from Dan to Victoria with the assessing gaze of someone who'd spent 68 years learning to read people. "You must be the Miss Victoria that Sophie has been telling me about all week." Victoria stood up from the swing, automatically smoothing her hair and straightening her clothes as she prepared to meet the woman who held such an important place in Dan and Sophie's life. "Mrs. Morrison," Victoria said, extending her hand with professional courtesy. "Sophie has told me so many wonderful things about you." Helen ignored the offered handshake and pulled Victoria into a warm hug that clearly surprised the younger woman. "And she's told me wonderful things about you. How you helped with her science project and came to her soccer game and know all about planets and stars." Victoria accepted the embrace with obvious emotion, and Dan realized this might be the first motherly hug she'd received since her own mother's death years earlier. "Please, call me Helen," the older woman said, stepping back to study Victoria's face with gentle eyes. "Anyone who makes Sophie this happy is family as far as I'm concerned." "Grandma Helen, can Miss Victoria really come to dinner next Sunday?" Sophie asked eagerly. "She doesn't have anywhere else to go, and you always make extra food anyway." Helen's eyes softened as she looked at Victoria, clearly seeing the loneliness that Dan had only recently discovered. "Of course she can come to dinner. In fact, I insist on it. It's been far too long since I've had another woman to cook for, and I have some stories about Sophie's mother that I think Victoria would enjoy hearing." The invitation was issued with such warmth and authority that Victoria couldn't possibly refuse without seeming ungracious. Dan watched her face cycle through surprise, gratitude, and a hint of panic as she realized she was about to be welcomed into the most sacred part of their family structure. "Thank you," Victoria said quietly. "I would be honored to join your family dinner." "Wonderful," Helen said, patting Victoria's arm with maternal affection. "Sunday at 4 o'clock. Dan knows the way, And don't bring anything except your appetite, and maybe some stories of your own to share. As Helen walked away after giving Sophie and Dan goodbye hugs, Victoria stood still in the park, looking slightly stunned. "That just happened," she said. "Helen has a way of making decisions for everyone." Dan explained, though his tone was fond rather than critical. "She basically adopted me after Rebecca died, and now apparently she's adopting you too." "How do you feel about that?" Victoria asked carefully. "About me having dinner with Rebecca's mother?" Dan considered the question seriously, surprised to realize that the idea didn't upset him as much as he'd expected. "I think Helen's right that it's time for our family dinners to include someone new," he said honestly, "and I think Rebecca would approve of you." That evening, after Sophie was in bed, Dan found himself on the phone with Helen, a conversation he'd been expecting since the park encounter. "She's lovely, Daniel," Helen said without preamble. "Elegant and kind and clearly smitten with our Sophie." "Helen," Dan said carefully, "Victoria is my boss. This whole situation is complicated enough without reading romantic intentions into friendly dinners. Friendship is where the best love stories begin," Helen replied, with the wisdom of someone who'd been married for 45 years before her husband's death. "And don't think I haven't noticed how you've been smiling more lately." "That's because Sophie's been happier," Dan protested, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. "Sophie's been happier because you've been happier," Helen corrected gently. "Rebecca always said she wanted you to find love again someday. I think she'd approve of Victoria very much." The conversation continued with Helen's gentle probing about Victoria's background and Dan's carefully evasive answers about the complexity of workplace relationships. But as Dan fell asleep that night, he found himself looking forward to Sunday dinner in ways that had nothing to do with Helen's excellent cooking, and everything to do with watching Victoria become part of their family story. Monday morning brought the return to professional reality that Dan had been dreading. Walking into Blackwell Communications after a weekend of personal connection with Victoria felt like entering an alternate universe where they had to pretend Saturday's science project and Sunday's park visit had never happened. Victoria was already in her office when Dan arrived, her blonde hair pulled back in its usual severe style. Wearing a charcoal business suit that transformed her back into the intimidating CEO who commanded boardrooms with icy precision. When their eyes met through her glass office door, she gave him the same polite nod she offered all employees, but Dan caught the slight softening around her eyes that suggested she was working as hard as he was to maintain professional distance. The morning passed with carefully orchestrated normalcy. Dan attended his usual Monday team meeting, reviewed client presentations, and responded to emails with the same competence he'd shown for 3 years. But underneath the routine, he was acutely aware of Victoria's presence in the building, of the strange disconnection between the woman who'd laughed on swings yesterday and the boss who was conducting a budget review meeting with surgical precision. At lunch, Marcus Chen cornered Dan in the break room with the investigative enthusiasm that made him excellent at client relations and terrible at respecting personal boundaries. "So," Marcus said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Dan with his sandwich, "what's the story with you and our beloved Ice Queen?" Dan nearly choked on his coffee. "What are you talking about?" "Please," Marcus scoffed. "Half the office has noticed that Victoria Blackwell has been almost human lately." She smiled during Friday's client presentation. She complimented Sarah's work in front of the entire creative team. She left the office at 6 o'clock last Tuesday instead of working until midnight. "Maybe she's just having a good quarter," Dan suggested weakly. "Nobody has quarters this good," Marcus replied. Plus, Janet from HR mentioned seeing Victoria at the grocery store yesterday morning, buying what looked suspiciously like ingredients for feeding a family. When Janet asked about it, Victoria got all flustered and mentioned something about helping someone special with their family traditions. Dan felt panic rising in his chest. Office gossip traveled at light speed, and the last thing he needed was speculation about his relationship with Victoria affecting either of their professional standing. "You're reading too much into normal behavior," Dan said, trying to keep his voice level. "Maybe Victoria's just learning to maintain better work-life balance." Marcus studied Dan's expression with the analytical skills that made him dangerous in both client negotiations and office gossip. Or maybe she's found someone worth maintaining work-life balance for. Before Dan could respond, Victoria herself appeared in the break room doorway, moving toward the coffee machine with the kind of grace that suggested she was completely unaware of being the subject of speculation. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Victoria said pleasantly, her tone perfectly professional as she prepared her usual afternoon coffee. "Afternoon, Victoria," Marcus replied with exaggerated casualness. "How was your weekend? Do anything interesting?" Dan watched Victoria's hand pause for just a moment on the coffee pot, saw the brief flicker of uncertainty before her professional mask slid back into place. "Just the usual," Victoria said smoothly. "Catching up on paperwork, attending to personal matters. You know how weekends are." "Personal matters?" Marcus murmured with obvious interest. "That sounds wonderfully mysterious." Victoria's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, and Dan realized that their careful professional distance was actually making their relationship more obvious rather than less. The conversation had been perfectly appropriate, but something about the way Victoria's eyes had lingered on Dan suggested there was more to the story. "I should get back to work," Dan said quickly. "The Morrison presentation needs final review before tomorrow's client meeting." "Of course," Victoria replied, her tone carefully neutral. "Please have it on my desk by 5 o'clock." As Dan left the break room, he caught Marcus watching him with speculative interest. The interaction had been flawlessly professional, but Dan could see the wheels turning behind his colleague's eyes, analyzing every glance and word for signs of hidden meaning. The rest of the week passed with increasing tension as Dan and Victoria worked to maintain professional distance while navigating the growing complexity of their personal connection. Victoria's transformation from intimidating boss to Sophie's beloved friend had created warmth in their professional interactions that was becoming difficult to hide from observant colleagues. Thursday afternoon brought the crisis Dan had been dreading. Victoria's assistant knocked on his cubicle with a request for an immediate meeting in Victoria's office regarding urgent client concerns. Dan found Victoria standing behind her desk with an expression that combined professional concern with personal worry. She waited until he closed the door before speaking. "We need to discuss something that could affect both our careers," she said without preamble. "What's happened?" "Richard Patterson called this morning," Victoria said, referring to one of their most important clients. "He's heard rumors about my personal life that he finds concerning for the stability of our business relationship." Dan felt ice form in his veins. "What kind of rumors? That I'm involved with an employee, that my judgment might be compromised, that perhaps his account should consider agencies with more professional standards." Victoria's voice was carefully controlled, but Dan could hear the fear underneath. The implications hit Dan like a physical blow. Victoria had built her business on reputation and client confidence. Even the suggestion of impropriety could damage relationships she'd spent years cultivating. "I'll transfer to another department," Dan said immediately, "or resign if necessary. It will be a clean separation, and you can honestly say any rumored relationship no longer poses a conflict." "Absolutely not," Victoria said firmly. "You're one of my best employees, and I won't let office gossip cost you your career. Then what do you suggest?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, staring out her window at the city below. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of difficult decisions. We need to be more careful, more professional, until we figure out how to handle this properly. What does that mean exactly? Victoria's next words felt like a door closing between them. It means no more personal conversations at work, no more lingering glances, no more anything that could be misconstrued as inappropriate professional conduct. Dan understood the logic, but the coldness in her tone made him wonder if she was having second thoughts about their relationship entirely. And outside of work? He asked carefully. Victoria's expression softened slightly. Outside of work, we continue as we have been. But here, we're strictly professional colleagues. What about Sophie? She's expecting you at Grandma Helen's dinner this Sunday. I'll be there, Victoria said without hesitation. Nothing will stop me from keeping that promise to her. The conversation ended with uncomfortable formality, and Dan returned to his desk, feeling like they'd somehow lost ground they might never recover. The joy and ease of their developing relationship had been replaced by anxiety and careful calculation that made every interaction feel fraught with potential misunderstanding. Sunday dinner at Helen Morrison's house had always been sacred ground for Dan and Sophie, a weekly ritual that honored Rebecca's memory while providing stability in their uncertain world. As Dan rang the doorbell with Victoria beside him, he felt the weight of crossing an invisible threshold between past and future. Helen opened the door wearing her favorite apron, the one Rebecca had given her for Christmas 3 years ago, and her face lit up when she saw Victoria. If she was surprised by Victoria's stunning appearance in her elegant blue dress and perfectly styled blonde hair, Helen hid it well behind grandmother's warmth. You must be Victoria, Helen said, immediately pulling her into a hug that Victoria accepted with obvious surprise and growing pleasure. I'm Helen Morrison, Rebecca's mother and Sophie's most devoted grandmother. Welcome to our home. Thank you for having me, Mrs. Morrison, Victoria said, offering the bouquet of white roses she'd brought. Sophie told me these were Rebecca's favorite flowers. Dan felt his breath catch. Victoria had remembered that detail from Sophie's rambling stories, had thought to honor Rebecca's memory in this simple but profound gesture. Helen's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the flowers. They were indeed. How thoughtful of you to remember. Helen's voice was thick with emotion. Please, call me Helen. Anyone Sophie adores this much is family. The evening unfolded with surprising ease. Victoria seemed genuinely enchanted by Helen's photo albums, listening intently to stories about Rebecca's childhood and asking questions that showed real interest rather than polite obligation. She admired Sophie's latest artwork displayed on Helen's refrigerator and complimented the grandmother's cooking with such sincere enthusiasm that Helen blushed like a schoolgirl. Sophie tells me you studied astrophysics, Helen said as they lingered over dessert, her famous apple pie that had been Rebecca's favorite. What made you switch to marketing? Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Life happened, she said quietly. After my husband died, I needed something that felt concrete, controllable. Business made sense when nothing else did. But you miss it, Helen observed with grandmother's intuition. The stars, I mean. Sometimes, Victoria admitted, glancing at Sophie, who was absorbed in building a tower with her dinner napkin. Especially on clear nights when I remember how vast and beautiful the universe is. Miss Victoria knows all the constellations, Sophie announced, abandoning her napkin architecture. She showed me Orion last week when we went for ice cream after my soccer game. Dan nearly choked on his coffee. Victoria had been to Sophie's soccer game? When had that happened? Seeing his confusion, Victoria smiled sheepishly. You were stuck in that client emergency meeting Wednesday evening. Sophie mentioned her game, so I offered to pick her up from school and take her. I hope that was okay. You went to a soccer game for 8-year-olds? Helen asked with obvious delight. It was wonderful, Victoria said, her eyes lighting up. Sophie scored 2 goals, and her team won 4-3. Though I may have gotten a little too enthusiastic cheering from the sidelines. She yelled louder than Coach Martinez. Sophie giggled. All the other parents stared, but I liked it. Nobody ever yells just for me except Daddy and Grandma Helen. Dan felt something warm and overwhelming expand in his chest. Victoria had not only attended Sophie's game, but had cheered enthusiastically enough to draw attention, caring more about his daughter's joy than her own professional image. After dinner, Sophie insisted on showing Victoria her latest obsession, a puzzle depicting the solar system that Helen had given her for her birthday. Victoria sat cross-legged on the living room floor in her expensive dress, helping Sophie sort edge pieces while explaining the differences between terrestrial and gas giant planets. Jupiter is my favorite, Sophie declared, holding up a piece that showed the great red spot. It's like a giant protector for all the smaller planets. That's exactly right, Victoria said warmly. Jupiter's gravity pulls in asteroids and comets that might otherwise hit Earth. It really is a protector. Dan watched from the kitchen doorway as Helen joined him with fresh coffee, her expression thoughtful as she observed Victoria and Sophie together. She's not what I expected, Helen said quietly. What did you expect? Someone harder. Colder. Sophie described her as a boss lady, which made me picture someone intimidating. Helen smiled softly. But look at her. She's sitting on my floor in a designer dress, explaining planetary science to an 8-year-old with the same patience I'd expect from a teacher. She's different outside of work, Dan said, still processing how naturally Victoria fit into their family dynamic. There, she's all business, but with Sophie she becomes someone completely different. She becomes herself, Helen finished. The woman she was before she had to build walls to protect herself. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Victoria help Sophie with a particularly challenging puzzle section. When Sophie leaned against Victoria's shoulder to point at a piece, Victoria's arm came around her naturally, as if holding children was something she'd been born to do. Daniel, Helen said carefully, how do you feel about her? The question Dan had been avoiding crystallized in the warmth of Helen's kitchen, surrounded by the sounds of Victoria and Sophie's laughter from the living room. Terrified, he admitted, but also hopeful in a way I haven't been since Rebecca died. When I'm with Victoria, I remember what it feels like to be part of a team instead of just surviving alone. And the guilt? Dan had known Helen would understand. She'd loved Rebecca like her own daughter, but had also watched Dan struggle with the isolation of single parenthood for 2 years. It's there, Dan said honestly, but less than I expected. Rebecca always said she wanted Sophie and me to be happy. I think she'd approve of Victoria. I know she would, Helen said firmly. Rebecca's gift was seeing the good in people, and she would have seen immediately what I see in Victoria tonight, which is a woman who's found her way home. The evening ended with Sophie falling asleep during a nature documentary, curled against Victoria's side on Helen's old sofa. Victoria made no move to disturb her, seeming content to serve as a human pillow while Dan and Helen cleaned up in the kitchen. I should get her to bed, Dan said softly when they returned to find both girls peacefully sleeping, Sophie's head on Victoria's lap, while Victoria's hand rested protectively in the child's auburn hair. 5 more minutes, Victoria whispered. She feels so perfect like this. Something in her tone made Dan look more closely. Victoria's eyes were bright with unshed tears, her expression tender and wondering, as she gazed down at his sleeping daughter. Victoria, are you okay? I'm perfect, she said softly. For the first time in years, everything feels perfect. When they finally transferred Sophie to Dan's car, she barely stirred, mumbling sleepily about wanting Victoria to come to breakfast tomorrow. As they stood in Helen's driveway saying goodbye, Victoria turned to the older woman with genuine emotion. "Thank you for welcoming me into your family tradition," Victoria said. "This was the best Sunday I've had since my husband died." "Nonsense," Helen replied, pulling Victoria into another fierce hug. "You're welcome here any time. In fact, I insist you come back next week. Someone needs to help me eat all this food." As they drove home, Sophie's soft snores from the back seat, Victoria reached over and took Dan's hand. Her fingers were warm and slightly trembling. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For letting me belong somewhere again. For sharing your family with someone who'd forgotten what family felt like." Dan squeezed her hand, his heart full of emotions too complex to name. "Thank you for showing us what joy looks like again." 3 weeks later, Sunday dinners with Helen had become their new normal. Victoria brought flowers each week, different varieties but always Rebecca's favorites, and Helen had taken to cooking enough food to guarantee leftovers for Victoria's solitary weekday meals. The transformation in Sophie was remarkable. The quiet sadness that had shadowed her since Rebecca's death was gradually being replaced by confidence and joy. She chatted constantly about Victoria's visits, her soccer games where Victoria cheered louder than any other parent, their after-school adventures that ranged from museum visits to ice cream expeditions to quiet homework sessions at Victoria's apartment. "Miss Victoria has a telescope on her balcony," Sophie announced during one dinner, barely pausing between bites of Helen's famous meatloaf. "She's teaching me about galaxies and black holes and nebula. Did you know some stars are so far away that their light takes millions of years to reach us?" "I did not know that," Helen said solemnly, though her eyes twinkled with amusement at Sophie's earnest excitement. "It means we're seeing them as they were millions of years ago," Sophie continued importantly. "Miss Victoria says it's like looking into the past every time we look at the sky." Dan watched Victoria's face during these dinner conversations, saw how she glowed under Sophie's enthusiastic attention, how she encouraged every question and celebrated every small understanding. Victoria was teaching his daughter that learning was an adventure, that curiosity was something to be nurtured rather than managed. But it was the quieter moments that revealed the depth of Victoria's integration into their lives. The way she automatically cut Sophie's meat into smaller pieces, knew without asking that Sophie preferred her vegetables separate from her mashed potatoes, remembered that Thursday was library day, and Friday was show and tell. Victoria was learning to love Sophie in all the small daily ways that built real relationships. After one particularly perfect Sunday, when Sophie had fallen asleep between them during a movie, Victoria turned to Dan with an expression that was both vulnerable and determined. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly, careful not to wake Sophie. "What is it?" "I'm falling in love with this," Victoria said, gesturing to encompass their cozy domestic scene. "With these dinners and soccer games and homework help and all the beautiful chaos that comes with loving a child. But mostly I'm falling in love with you." Dan's heart stopped. "Victoria," he started. "I know it's complicated," she continued quickly. "I know there are a million practical considerations and office policies and ways this could go wrong. But I also know that for the first time in 4 years, I wake up excited about something other than quarterly reports." Dan reached for her hand, threading their fingers together. "I'm falling in love with you too," he admitted. "With the woman who cheers at soccer games and explains constellations and makes my daughter light up like Christmas morning." They sat in the soft glow of Helen's living room, holding hands while Sophie slept peacefully between them, And Dan realized that love didn't always arrive with fanfare and dramatic gestures. Sometimes it grew quietly in Sunday dinners and shared laughter, in small kindnesses and daily presence. Sometimes it felt like coming home. But their growing happiness was about to face its greatest test. Because love stories that begin with accidental text messages and develop through corporate hierarchies don't get to avoid the complications that come with mixing professional and personal lives. And Victoria was about to discover just how much she was willing to sacrifice for the family she'd never expected to find. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after Victoria had become a regular fixture in Dan and Sophie's life. Dan arrived at work to find the office buzzing with an energy that felt different from usual Monday motivation. Conversation stopped when he passed, and he caught several co-workers exchanging meaningful glances when they thought he wasn't looking. Tom Morrison, the company's senior partner and Victoria's longtime mentor, was waiting in Dan's cubicle with an expression that suggested this conversation wouldn't be pleasant. "Mr. Carter," Tom said without preamble, "I need you in the conference room in 10 minutes. Bring your current project files and any personal items from your workspace." Dan's stomach dropped. That language typically preceded termination meetings. "Is there a problem with my work?" "We'll discuss everything in the conference room," Tom replied, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. The meeting was every bit as uncomfortable as Dan had feared. Tom Morrison sat at the head of the polished conference table with Janet from HR and 2 board members Dan barely recognized. Victoria was nowhere to be seen. "Mr. Carter," Tom began, "it's come to our attention that there may be a personal relationship between you and senior management that creates potential conflicts of interest." Dan felt the walls closing in around him. The office gossip had finally reached the executive level, and now his career and Victoria's reputation were both at risk. "What exactly are you alleging?" Dan asked. "We're not alleging anything," Janet from HR interjected smoothly. "We're simply clarifying company policy regarding relationships between supervisors and direct reports. There are established protocols for addressing these situations," Tom continued. "Transfer to another department, reassignment of supervisory responsibilities, or if necessary, employment termination." "Are you firing me?" Dan asked directly. "We're offering solutions," Tom replied. "None of which need to be implemented if there's no conflict of interest to address." Dan realized they were being asked to either deny their relationship or face professional consequences that could destroy everything Victoria had worked to build. "Where is Victoria in this conversation?" Dan asked. "Shouldn't she be part of any discussion that affects her professional standing?" "Ms. Blackwell has already been informed of our concerns," Tom said carefully. "She's requested time to consider the best path forward for all parties involved." Dan felt betrayed and confused. Victoria had agreed to this meeting without him? Had she decided their relationship wasn't worth fighting for? "I need to speak with Victoria directly," Dan said. "That's not possible right now," Tom replied. "We need your answer by Friday. Either confirm that there's no inappropriate relationship to address, or we'll implement the necessary protocol changes." Dan left the meeting feeling like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Everything he and Victoria had built together, every moment of connection and growing love, was being threatened by corporate policies that reduced human relationships to liability management. But Dan didn't know that Victoria was at that very moment in her own office, staring at a resignation letter she'd been writing since dawn. She'd been given the same ultimatum, told that her relationship with Dan was jeopardizing client confidence and company stability. Victoria had built her business from nothing, sacrificed personal happiness for professional success, created an agency that reflected her vision and values. But sitting in her office, Looking at family photos from recent Sunday dinners that had appeared on her desk without her quite realizing it, Victoria made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to choose between her career and her family again. She'd made that mistake once, prioritizing work over love when James had begged her to take time off, to focus on their marriage, to build a life together instead of just parallel careers. She wouldn't lose Dan and Sophie the way she'd lost James, to corporate demands that treated love like weakness and family like distraction. Victoria picked up her phone and sent a text to Dan. "Meet me at our park tonight after Sophie's bedtime. There's something I need to tell you." That evening, Dan found Victoria sitting on the bench where they'd spent their first afternoon together months earlier. She looked different, somehow lighter despite the serious expression on her face. "Victoria," he began, but she held up a hand. "Let me go first," she said. "I've been thinking about what Tom Morrison and the board are really asking us to do. They want us to choose between our professional obligations and our personal happiness. Decide whether love is worth the risk of losing everything we've worked for." Dan's heart sank. She was going to choose her career. He couldn't blame her, but the disappointment was crushing. "I have my answer," Victoria continued, pulling an envelope from her purse. "I resigned this morning." Dan stared at her, certain he'd misheard. "You what?" "I quit," Victoria said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I refuse to work for people who think loving you and Sophie is a liability instead of the best thing that's ever happened to me." "Victoria, you can't sacrifice your career for us. You've worked too hard, built too much." "I'm not sacrificing anything," Victoria said firmly. "I'm choosing what matters. I spent 4 years hiding behind professional success because it felt safer than risking my heart again. I won't go back to that, Dan. I won't lose you and Sophie because some board members are afraid of office gossip. But your business, everything you've built, will survive just fine without me, or it will give me the opportunity to build something better." Victoria's eyes were bright with tears and determination. "Marcus has already agreed to come with me. So have Sarah and 3 other designers. We're starting our own agency, one that values family as much as profit margins." Dan felt his world tilt as the implications sank in. Victoria was risking everything she'd built, betting her professional future on their relationship. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Really sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Victoria said, reaching for his hands. "I love you, Dan. I love Sophie like she's my own daughter. I want to build a life with you that doesn't require us to hide or apologize for caring about each other." Before Dan could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message from Sophie, who was supposedly asleep at Helen's house for the evening. "Daddy, did you ask Miss Victoria to marry us yet? Grandma Helen says you should hurry up before someone else does." Victoria laughed through her tears as Dan showed her the message. "I think our daughter has some opinions about our timeline." "Our daughter," Dan repeated, loving the way those words sounded. "Victoria, I love you too. I love you enough to support whatever decision you make, even if it means leaving Seattle for better opportunities. We're not going anywhere." Victoria said firmly, "This is our home. These are our people. We're going to build something beautiful right here." 6 months later, Second Chances Creative occupied a bright, modern office space in a renovated warehouse downtown. The walls were covered with award-winning campaigns, client testimonials, and photos from company events that included families and children. It was everything Victoria had envisioned: successful, innovative, and genuinely supportive of work-life balance. The agency had exceeded all expectations. 5 of Blackwell Communications' major clients had followed Victoria, attracted by her vision of marketing that prioritized authentic human connection. The team of 12 employees worked collaboratively in an open environment where Victoria's leadership style had evolved from intimidating authority to inspiring mentorship. Dan's role as creative director had allowed him to flourish in ways his old position never permitted. His campaigns for local non-profits and family-owned businesses had won regional recognition, and his work schedule gave him flexibility to be present for Sophie's school events and daily needs. But the most remarkable transformation was in their family dynamic. Victoria had essentially moved into Dan and Sophie's house, though she maintained her apartment for the sake of appearances. Most evenings found her helping with homework while Dan cooked dinner, and most mornings began with the three of them sharing breakfast before starting their respective days. Sophie had thrived under the attention of two adults who both prioritized her well-being. Her grades improved, her confidence soared, and she'd started talking about Victoria as Mommy. Victoria in a way that felt natural rather than forced. One evening in early spring, as Victoria was putting Sophie to bed while Dan cleaned up dinner dishes, Sophie asked the question that would change everything. "Mummy Victoria," she said seriously, "when are you and Daddy getting married for real?" Victoria's heart stuttered. "We haven't really talked about that yet, sweetheart. But you love each other, right? And we're already a family. So when do we make it official?" Victoria tucked the blankets around Sophie's shoulders, marveling at 8-year-old logic that cut straight to the heart of complex adult emotions. "What would you think about that?" Victoria asked. "If Daddy and I got married?" "I think it would be the best thing ever," Sophie said solemnly. "Then you'd really be my mommy, and we'd really be a forever family." That night, as Victoria and Dan sat on their back porch, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the stars emerge in the clear sky, Victoria brought up Sophie's question. "She wants to know when we're getting married," Victoria said with a smile. "Apparently our timeline is too slow for her taste." Dan set down his wine glass and turned to face Victoria fully. "What did you tell her?" "That we haven't talked about it yet." "But Dan, I want to talk about it. I want to marry you. I want to adopt Sophie legally and officially become her mother. I want us to be a real family in every sense of the word." Dan's smile was radiant in the porch light. "I want that too. I've wanted it for months, but wasn't sure if you were ready for that kind of commitment." Victoria reached for his hands, threading their fingers together with the gesture that had become second nature to them both. "I'm ready for everything," she said. "Marriage, family, the whole beautiful, chaotic adventure of building a life together." Dan pulled her closer, kissing her with all the love and gratitude and hope that had been building since that first accidental text message. "Will you marry me, Victoria Blackwell?" he whispered against her lips. "Will you be Sophie's mother and my wife and the center of our family?" "Yes," Victoria whispered back. "Yes to all of it. Forever and always, yes." From inside the house came the sound of 8-year-old feet hitting the floor as Sophie snuck to her bedroom window to eavesdrop on the conversation she'd been hoping to hear for months. The wedding took place 6 months later in the botanical gardens where Sophie loved to explore, surrounded by friends and colleagues from Second Chances Creative and Helen Morrison, who served as both grandmother of the bride and keeper of Rebecca's blessing on their union. Victoria wore a simple ivory dress that accommodated the small but growing bump that announced their newest family member would arrive in early spring. The baby had been a surprise, a gift that seemed to confirm the universe approved of their choices. Sophie served as maid of honor, taking her responsibilities seriously and declaring to anyone who would listen that she was getting both a new mommy and a new baby sibling, which made her the luckiest kid in the entire world. As Victoria walked down the aisle toward Dan, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years earlier, she'd been a lonely workaholic who'd convinced herself professional success was enough. Dan had been a struggling single father going through the motions of survival. Now they were a family, choosing each other intentionally and joyfully, building something beautiful from the broken pieces of their individual losses. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was witnessed by everyone who mattered, including Helen Morrison, who whispered to herself that Rebecca would be so proud of the love they'd found. The reception was held in the same gardens, with dancing under string lights and toasts that celebrated not just their marriage, but the courage it took to choose love over safety, family over convenience, hope over fear. Marcus gave a speech that had everyone laughing about the office gossip that had started it all, crediting his investigative skills with bringing them together. Helen spoke about the beauty of watching broken hearts learn to heal. Sophie gave her own toast, declaring that fairy tales were real, and sometimes they started with daddies who forgot how to use their phones properly. As the evening wound down and they prepared to leave for their honeymoon, a weekend at the coast that accommodated Victoria's pregnancy and Sophie's schedule, Victoria found herself overwhelmed by gratitude for the life they'd built together. "Thank you," she said to Dan as they swayed together on the makeshift dance floor, Sophie asleep in Helen's arms nearby. "For what? For sending that text message. For being brave enough to let me into your life. For giving me a family when I thought I'd lost my chance at that kind of happiness." "Thank you for responding," Dan replied, his hand resting protectively on her growing belly. "For showing up when you could have just handled it, professionally. For loving Sophie and me enough to risk everything you'd built." "Sometimes," Victoria said, looking around at their friends and family celebrating their happiness. "The best things in life begin with accidents that lead us exactly where we need to be." 3 years later, their house was filled with the beautiful chaos of a complete family. Baby James toddled between his big sister Sophie and his parents, chattering in a mix of words and babble that had everyone convinced he was destined for advanced verbal skills. Sophie, now 11 and wise beyond her years, had fully embraced her role as big sister and helper, teaching James about planets and dinosaurs with the same patience Victoria had once shown her with science projects. Second Chance's Creative had grown into one of the most respected agencies in the Pacific Northwest, known not just for excellent work, but for innovative approaches to work-life balance that had been featured in business magazines as a model for the future of professional environments. Dan and Victoria had found their rhythm as both business partners and spouses, supporting each other's professional growth while prioritizing their family's needs. They'd learned that love didn't require sacrifice when it was built on mutual respect and shared values. But the most beautiful part of their story wasn't the professional success or even the personal happiness. It was the way they'd created a family that honored the past while embracing the future, that made room for Rebecca's memory while celebrating Victoria's place in their lives. Every Sunday dinner at Helen's house included stories about Rebecca that kept her alive in Sophie's memory and expressions of gratitude for Victoria's love that made everyone feel blessed rather than guilty about their happiness. On a quiet evening in late spring, as Victoria nursed baby James while watching Dan help Sophie with homework and listening to 11-year-old chatter about middle school preparations, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Sometimes the most important messages in our lives are the ones we never meant to send, she thought, remembering that late-night text that had started everything. But it wasn't really about the accident, Victoria realized. It was about the choice to respond with kindness instead of professional distance. The choice to show up on Saturday morning with coffee and help. The choice to keep showing up day after day, building trust and love through small acts of care and presence. Dan looked up from Sophie's math homework and caught Victoria's expression, reading her thoughts with the intuition that came from years of partnership. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. How grateful I am for accidental text messages that lead to intentional families. Victoria replied, shifting James to her shoulder for burping, while Sophie announced she'd finally mastered long division. Best accident ever. Dan agreed, moving to kiss Victoria's forehead, while Sophie rolled her eyes at their constant displays of affection. As their family settled into evening routines, with James falling asleep to Sophie's gentle singing, and Victoria and Dan cleaning up the remnants of another chaotic but perfect day, Victoria felt the deep contentment that came from living authentically. They'd built something real together, something that honored their individual losses while celebrating their collective gains, something that proved love could triumph over fear, family could triumph over convenience, and sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as mistakes that led us exactly where we needed to be. And every night, as Victoria fell asleep beside Dan, with their children safe and happy under the same roof, she whispered a silent thank you to the universe for wrong numbers that turned into right answers, for lonely hearts that found each other in the darkness, and for the beautiful truth that it's never too late to begin again when you're brave enough to let love in. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, if it reminded you that second chances exist and that love can find us in the most unexpected ways, please don't let it end here. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of accidental moments that change everything. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about ordinary people who discovered that extraordinary love was just one brave choice away. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that their story isn't over, that new chapters are waiting to be written, and that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose rather than the ones we're born into. And remember, whether you're sending late-night texts or receiving unexpected kindness, every moment is a chance to choose connection over isolation, hope over fear, and love over safety. Your perfect family might be just one accidental message away from finding you. Thanks for watching, and remember that miracles often wear the disguise of ordinary Tuesday afternoons when lonely hearts decide to be brave enough to reach out and let someone else reach back. Just 5 more minutes and I can lock up. Ryan Thompson wiped his grease-stained hands on the red shop rag hanging from his back pocket, the same pocket that had held his uncle's tools for 15 years before they became his. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor of Morrison Auto Repair. Well, it wasn't Morrison's anymore. It was Thompson's now, though Ryan had never gotten around to changing the faded sign out front. The last customer had picked up their Honda Civic 3 hours ago, but Ryan kept finding reasons to stay. Reorganizing tools that were already organized, checking oil levels in cars that wouldn't be picked up until Monday, sweeping corners that were already clean. Anything to avoid going upstairs to his apartment where the silence waited like a hungry animal. Ryan's hands told the story of his life better than words ever could. Thick calluses marked the spots where wrenches had rubbed for 12 years. Permanent grease stains darkened the creases of his palms, no matter how hard he scrubbed. A scar from his thumb to his wrist remembered the day he'd learned to respect power tools, courtesy of Uncle Pete's patient teaching. These hands had rebuilt engines, changed thousands of oil filters, and held his uncle's trembling fingers during those final weeks when cancer took away everything except Pete's stubborn determination to teach Ryan the business. But these hands had never learned to hold on to love. Ryan locked the cash register and flipped off the lights, leaving only the security lamp glowing near the door. His footsteps echoed as he walked toward the narrow staircase that led to his apartment. Each step creaked the same way they had when Uncle Pete lived here, when this place hummed with life instead of just the steady tick of the wall clock. The apartment was exactly what you'd expect from a 30-year-old bachelor who worked 70 hours a week. Mismatched furniture that had come with the place. A kitchen table covered in bills and automotive magazines. A refrigerator decorated with takeout menus and a single photo of Uncle Pete standing proudly next to a restored 1967 Mustang. Ryan opened the refrigerator and stared at its contents. 3 bottles of beer, leftover Chinese food from Tuesday, a carton of milk that probably expired last week. He grabbed a beer and a frozen dinner, the kind that promised to be ready in 4 minutes and tasted like cardboard mixed with salt. The microwave hummed while Ryan stood at his kitchen window looking down at the empty street. Friday night, 8:15. Across the street, families were settling in for movie nights. Couples were getting dressed for dinner dates. Groups of friends were heading out to bars and restaurants, their laughter floating up through the autumn air. Ryan took a long pull from his beer and tried not to think about Sarah. Sarah Wilson. Sarah Thompson for exactly 18 months. The woman who had walked into his life like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, who had made him believe that maybe a grease monkey from the wrong side of town could have something beautiful. She'd been a teacher at the elementary school down the street. Brought her car in for an oil change on a rainy Tuesday morning, wearing a yellow dress that made her red hair look like fire. Ryan had fallen in love with her laugh before he even knew her name. For 2 years they'd built something that felt real. Sarah would come by the shop after school, sitting on the old couch in the waiting area, while Ryan finished up with customers. She'd grade papers and ask about his day, genuinely interested in stories about Mrs. Chen's ancient Corolla, or the teenager who was saving up to buy his first car. They'd gotten married on a Saturday in October, just a small ceremony at City Hall, with Uncle Pete as the witness. Sarah had worn a simple white dress and carried sunflowers. Ryan had never felt so proud, so complete, so sure that his life was finally heading in the right direction. The divorce papers had arrived on a Tuesday. Ryan found them on the kitchen table when he came upstairs for lunch next to a cup of coffee that was still warm. Sarah's neat handwriting covered a single sheet of notebook paper. Ryan, I can't do this anymore. I thought I could, but I can't. I need more than this. I need someone who can give me a real life, not just survival. I'm 28 years old and I feel like I'm drowning. You're a good man, but you're not enough for me. I deserve better than a life of struggle and grease stains and wondering if we'll ever have anything more than this. I've taken half of our savings. Consider it a fair trade for 2 years of my life. Don't look for me. Sarah. That had been 18 months ago. Ryan hadn't dated since. Hadn't even thought about it, really. What was the point? Sarah was right. He was just a mechanic. He fixed other people's problems for $40 an hour and went home to an empty apartment above a shop that barely paid the bills. The microwave beeped, pulling Ryan back to the present. He carried his dinner to the couch and turned on the television, cycling through channels until he found the old movie he'd seen a dozen times. Something familiar and safe, where he knew exactly how it would end. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. Ryan glanced at it, expecting to see a text from his mother, or maybe Mrs. Chen asking if he could look at her car again this weekend. Instead, he saw a name he hadn't seen in 12 years. Derek Matthews. Ryan stared at the screen for a long moment. Derek Matthews from Roosevelt High School. Derek Matthews, who drove a brand new BMW to school every day while Ryan rode the city bus. Derek Matthews, who dated cheerleaders and threw parties in his parents' mansion while Ryan worked weekends at Uncle Pete's shop. Derek Matthews, who had never spoken to Ryan beyond the occasional nod in the hallway. Ryan opened the message. Hey Ryan, remember me from high school? I've been thinking about old times and realized we lost touch. I have this friend who's perfect for you. She's smart, beautiful, and really wants to meet you. Dinner at Meridian tomorrow at 7. I already made the reservation. Her name is Isabella. You won't regret this, trust me. It's time you met someone who appreciates a good man. Ryan read the message 3 times, his frozen dinner growing cold in his lap. Derek Matthews setting him up on a blind date. Derek Matthews remembering he existed. It didn't make sense, but it had been 18 months since Sarah left. 18 months of microwave dinners and empty weekends. 18 months of watching his life tick by one lonely day at a time. His mother had been calling more often lately, her voice carefully casual when she asked if he was seeing anyone. Martha Thompson was 72 years old and worried about her son in the way only mothers could worry. She'd loved Sarah like a daughter and cried when she heard about the divorce. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe Derek had grown up, matured, become the kind of person who thought about old classmates and wanted to help. Maybe this Isabella was exactly what Ryan needed to start believing in possibilities again. Ryan typed back quickly before he could change his mind. "Sure sounds good. Thanks for thinking of me." He sent the message and immediately wondered if he'd made a mistake. But it was too late now. Tomorrow night, he would put on his best shirt and try to remember how to talk to a woman who wasn't asking about brake pads or transmission fluid. For the first time in 18 months, Ryan Thompson allowed himself to hope. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that at that exact moment, Derek Matthews was laughing so hard he could barely breathe. He actually said yes. Derek Matthews held his phone up for his friends to see his perfectly white teeth gleaming in a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. He was stretched out on his leather sectional sofa, a glass of wine that cost more than Ryan's monthly grocery budget balanced on his chest. The penthouse apartment looked like something out of a magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city lights. Modern art hung on walls painted in carefully chosen neutral tones. Everything was expensive, tasteful, and completely devoid of personality, just like Derek himself. Trevor Ross snatched the phone from Derek's hand, reading Ryan's response with the kind of glee usually reserved for children pulling wings off butterflies. "Oh, this is going to be beautiful." Can you imagine Ryan Thompson actually thinks someone like Isabella Hart would be interested in a grease monkey? The third man in the room, Austin Blake, was already scrolling through his own phone, pulling up social media profiles. "I found him. Look at this." He turned his screen toward the others, showing Ryan's sparse Facebook profile. The profile picture was at least 3 years old, taken at some company picnic. Ryan was smiling, but even in the photo he looked tired, worn down by life in a way that men their age shouldn't look. "God, he looks exactly like he did in high school," Austin said with a sneer. "Still wearing clothes from Walmart, still looking like he crawled out from under a car." Derek took another sip of wine, savoring both the vintage and the anticipation. Isabella Hart, daughter of William Hart, CEO of Hart Industries. 27 years old, blonde, beautiful, and worth approximately $50 million. She's perfect for this. Before we continue, please tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. The three men had known each other since prep school, bonded by shared privilege and a complete lack of empathy for anyone outside their circle. They'd spent their 20s climbing corporate ladders, building investment portfolios, and refining their ability to look down on everyone else. Derek worked at Kensington Financial, specializing in mergers and acquisitions. It was the kind of job that required expensive suits, Swiss watches, and the ability to destroy lives with a signature. He was good at it, mostly because he genuinely enjoyed watching other people fail. Trevor managed his trust fund and called it a career. Austin worked in real estate, selling multi-million-dollar properties to people who had more money than sense. Together they represented everything wrong with inherited wealth and unearned confidence. They'd been drinking since 6, celebrating Austin's latest sale, when Derek had gotten the brilliant idea to look up old high school classmates on social media. The plan had evolved naturally, the way cruelty often does among people who have never faced real consequences. "So how does this work?" Trevor asked, refilling his wine glass from a bottle that cost $400. "We just watch from across the restaurant while she destroys him?" Derek's smile widened. "Better than that. I've already talked to Isabella. Well, her assistant anyway. Told them I was organizing a charity mixer, wanted to introduce her to some eligible bachelors. She thinks this is a legitimate setup? But it's not," Austin said, catching on quickly. "She doesn't know about the joke." "Exactly." Derek pulled up Isabella's Instagram profile, scrolling through photos of charity galas and business conferences. "Look at her. Designer everything, private schools, country club membership. She's never been within 10 feet of someone like Ryan Thompson. The minute she sees him walk into Meridian in his bargain store clothes, she'll realize what's happening." And then Trevor was practically bouncing with anticipation. "And then she'll either laugh in his face or make some excuse to leave. Either way, we film the whole thing." Derek held up his phone, already imagining the viral video that would make them social media famous. Imagine the caption: "Poor mechanic thinks he has a chance with billionaire heiress. Watch what happens next." The cruelty was breathtaking in its casual efficiency. They weren't just planning to humiliate Ryan for their own entertainment. They were planning to destroy him publicly, to turn his hope into a joke that strangers would share and laugh at. Austin was already planning the technical details. "I'll sit at the table next to theirs. Get good audio. Trevor, you position yourself near the door for the wide shots. Derek can handle the close-ups. What if she doesn't react the way we think Trevor asked? What if she's nice to him?" Derek's laugh was cold as winter rain. "Isabella Hart. Please, she's society royalty. She dates senators' sons and tech billionaires. Trust me, she'll take one look at Ryan's calloused hands and run screaming back to her daddy's money." They spent another hour planning, working out camera angles and timing. They discussed which social media platforms would give them the most views, how to edit the footage for maximum humiliation, what hashtags would make the video trend. None of them questioned whether they should do this. None of them considered how it might affect Ryan, who was probably lying in bed at that moment, nervous and excited about the possibility of connection. None of them wondered if maybe they'd outgrown the casual cruelty that had made them popular in high school. They were 30 years old, but in their hearts they were still 17. Still the boys who had made other kids' lives miserable because they could, because their parents' money protected them from consequences. Derek finished his wine and stood up, stretching like a satisfied cat. "Gentlemen, tomorrow night we're going to create internet gold. Ryan Thompson is about to learn that some people stay in their lane for a reason." Trevor and Austin gathered their coats, already planning their Saturday night around editing and uploading the footage they would capture. They shook hands like businessmen closing a deal, partners in an enterprise built on someone else's pain. After his friends left, Derek stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Ryan Thompson was probably lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the possibility of love. Somewhere out there, Isabella Hart was going through her calendar, preparing for what she thought was a legitimate introduction to an eligible bachelor. Neither of them knew they were being set up to star in Derek's cruel theater. Derek poured himself another glass of wine and raised it in a toast to his own cleverness. Tomorrow night he would remind the world that there were still lines that couldn't be crossed, that some people belonged in certain places, and others knew better than to reach too high. He went to sleep smiling, dreaming of viral videos and social media fame, completely unaware that he was about to learn a lesson about assumptions and the price of underestimating other people's worth. Ryan stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering if he could somehow transform himself into the kind of man who belonged at a place called Meridian. The restaurant's website had been a mistake to look at. White tablecloths, crystal chandeliers, entrees. That cost more than Ryan typically spent on groceries in a week. The kind of place where people wore watches that cost more than his truck and talked about wine like it was literature. He'd been standing in front of his closet for 20 minutes trying to figure out what a mechanic wore to dinner with a woman named Isabella. His wardrobe consisted mainly of work shirts, blue jeans, and exactly one dress shirt that he'd worn to Uncle Pete's funeral 3 years ago. The funeral shirt was clean but wrinkled, and when Ryan held it up to the light, he could see where the moths had been at it. Small holes near the collar, a stain on the cuff that might have been from the reception afterward. This wasn't going to work. Ryan grabbed his keys and drove to the nearest department store, the kind of place where everything was affordable because nothing was particularly good. The men's section smelled like sizing and artificial air freshener. Fluorescent lights made everyone look sickly and pale. He found himself overwhelmed by choices he'd never had to make. What was the difference between a dress shirt and a casual shirt? Were khakis dressy enough, or did he need actual dress pants? Should he buy a tie, and if so, what color went with cream? The saleswoman who approached him was about his mother's age, with kind eyes and sensible shoes. She took one look at his confused expression and immediately understood the situation. "Special occasion?" she asked gently. "Dinner date," Ryan admitted. "Somewhere fancy. I don't really know what I'm doing." She smiled and led him through the store like a patient teacher. They settled on a cream-colored button-down shirt that didn't require dry cleaning. Dark khaki pants that were nicer than his work clothes, but not so formal that he'd feel like he was playing dress-up, and a simple brown belt that almost matched his only good pair of shoes. The total came to $87.32. Ryan's checking account had exactly $412 in it until his next customer payments came in. Spending almost a quarter of his available cash on clothes for one evening felt reckless, but he handed over his debit card anyway. "You look nice," the saleswoman said as he tried everything on in the fitting room. She's lucky to be having dinner with such a thoughtful man. Ryan hoped she was right. Back home, he hung his new clothes carefully in the closet and spent the rest of the afternoon trying not to think too hard about the evening ahead. He cleaned the apartment even though no one would see it. He organized his tools even though they were already organized. He changed the oil in his truck even though it didn't need changing. At 5 o'clock, he called his mother. Martha Thompson had been a widow for 8 years, living in the same small house where Ryan had grown up. She answered on the second ring the way she always did, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Ryan, honey, how are you?" "Good, Mom." "Listen, I wanted to tell you something. I have a date tonight." The silence on the other end stretched just long enough for Ryan to picture his mother's face lighting up with the first hope she'd felt for him since Sarah left. "Oh, Ryan, that's wonderful. Tell me about her. Her name is Isabella. I don't know much about her yet, but she seems nice." "Derek Matthews set us up. Derek from high school." Martha's voice carried a note of surprise. "You two weren't particularly close, were you?" "No, but people change. Maybe he thought we'd be good for each other." Martha was quiet for a moment, and Ryan could almost hear her choosing her words carefully. "Just be yourself, honey. You're a good man with a kind heart. Any woman would be lucky to have you." "Thanks, Mom. I should probably get ready." "Call me tomorrow, will you? I want to hear all about it." Ryan promised he would, and hung up the phone feeling both better and worse. Better because his mother's faith in him never wavered, worse because he was terrified of disappointing her again. He showered for the second time that day, scrubbing his hands with the pumice soap he kept for getting grease stains out. His palms were raw by the time he finished, but there were still traces of oil under his fingernails that wouldn't come out. 12 years of working with his hands had left permanent marks that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Getting dressed felt like putting on a costume. The new shirt was stiffer than his usual clothes, the pants a little loose in the waist because he'd been too embarrassed to ask the saleswoman to measure him properly. He looked at himself in the full-length mirror and saw a man trying too hard to be something he wasn't. But maybe that was okay. Maybe sometimes you had to try to be better than you were. Ryan's truck needed 3 tries to start, and the engine made a clicking noise that he'd been meaning to investigate for the past month. He drove slowly through the early evening traffic, giving himself plenty of time to find the restaurant and maybe sit in the parking lot for a few minutes to work up his courage. Meridian was in the part of the city where Ryan never went, where the streets were wider and cleaner, where the cars parked along the curbs cost more than most people's houses. The restaurant itself was a converted mansion, all white columns and brick walls with soft lighting spilling from tall windows onto manicured gardens. Ryan sat in his truck for 10 minutes watching well-dressed couples walk through the front door. The men wore suits that fit perfectly, moved with the confidence that came from knowing they belonged. The women looked like they'd stepped out of magazines, their hair and makeup flawless, their jewelry catching the light from the entrance chandelier. He thought about starting his truck and driving home. He could call Derek, make up some excuse about feeling sick or having a work emergency. He could go back to his apartment and his microwave dinner and his quiet Saturday evening. But then he thought about his mother's excited voice, about the hope in her words when he'd told her about the date. He thought about Uncle Pete, who had always told him that backing down from a challenge was the only real failure. Most of all, he thought about Sarah's note. "You're not enough for me. I deserve better." Maybe Isabella would think the same thing. Maybe she'd take one look at him and realize she'd made a mistake. But at least he'd tried. At least he'd been brave enough to walk through that door and find out. Ryan checked his reflection in the rearview mirror one more time, straightened his collar, and got out of the truck. The valet looked surprised when Ryan handed him the keys to a 10-year-old pickup truck, but he was professional enough not to comment. Ryan watched his truck disappear behind the building, hoping it would start when the evening was over. The entrance doors were heavy glass and brass, the kind that whispered expensive with every detail. Ryan pushed them open and stepped into a world he'd only seen in movies. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, Rich carpet muffled the sound of conversation and clinking silverware. The hostess stand was mahogany polished to a mirror shine, staffed by a woman who looked like she could be on television. She glanced up as Ryan approached, and he saw her eyes flicker over his carefully chosen outfit with the kind of assessment that left him feeling transparent. Her smile was professional, but cool, the sort of expression that suggested she'd dealt with people who didn't quite belong before. "Good evening," she said.
Do you have a reservation?
Ryan cleared his throat. "Yes, under Matthews. I'm meeting someone named Isabella." The hostess's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. "Of course. Right this way, please." She led him through the dining room, and Ryan felt every eye in the place tracking his movement. Conversations paused as he passed. He heard whispers that might have been about him or might have been his imagination. The table she led him to was near the center of the room, visible from every angle. 2 place settings, cream napkins folded into perfect triangles, water glasses that sparkled under the chandelier light. "Your server will be right with you," the hostess said. "Miss Hart should be arriving shortly." Ryan sat down carefully, afraid of disturbing the precise arrangement of silverware and plates. He looked around the room and felt his stomach drop as he recognized a familiar face in the corner. Derek Matthews sat at a large table with 2 other men, all of them dressed in expensive suits, all of them watching Ryan with barely contained amusement. Derek raised his wine glass in a mock toast, his smile sharp as a blade. That's when Ryan knew. This wasn't a setup for romance. It was a setup for humiliation. He was the joke, the entertainment, the poor mechanic who'd been foolish enough to think he deserved to be here. He started to stand up, ready to walk out with whatever dignity he had left, when the restaurant doors opened and a woman walked in. Even from across the room, even through his embarrassment and growing anger, Ryan could see that she was beautiful beyond anything he'd imagined. Blonde hair that caught the light, a figure that made every man in the restaurant notice, and a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. She was exactly the kind of woman who would never look twice at someone like him. And she was walking straight toward his table. The entrance doors of Meridian opened like the parting of curtains on a stage, and Isabella Hart stepped into the restaurant's golden light as if she'd been born to it. She was a vision in red silk, but not the kind of obvious beauty that demanded attention through sheer force. Instead, she possessed an elegance that drew every eye in the room through subtle magnetism. Her blonde hair had been styled in soft waves that moved like water with each step, catching the chandelier light and throwing it back in shimmers of gold and honey. The dress she wore was a masterpiece of understated luxury. Red silk that hugged her figure without being obvious about it, cut with the precision that only came from designers who understood that true sophistication whispered rather than shouted. It fell to just below her knees, revealing legs that seemed to go on forever, before disappearing into heels that probably cost more than Ryan's monthly rent. But what made every person in Meridian pause their conversations wasn't just Isabella's striking beauty. It was the confidence with which she carried herself, the unmistakable bearing of someone who had never questioned her right to enter any room anywhere in the world. She moved like royalty, not through arrogance, but through the quiet certainty that came from a lifetime of knowing she belonged. Diamond earrings caught the light with every turn of her head, simple enough to be tasteful, expensive enough to announce her status to anyone who understood such things. A pearl bracelet on her left wrist was the only other jewelry she wore, but it was enough. On Isabella Hart, anything more would have been gilding the lily. Yet despite all this perfection, all this obvious wealth and breeding, she wasn't alone. The little girl holding her hand was like a miniature version of her mother, dressed in a red silk dress that matched Isabella's perfectly. Sophie Hart had inherited her mother's blonde hair, though hers fell in ringlets that bounced with each step. Her shoes were tiny versions of grown-up heels, and she wore a pearl bracelet that was clearly meant to match her mother's. But where Isabella moved with practiced grace, Sophie bounced with the irrepressible energy of a 3-year-old who found the entire world fascinating. Her wide blue eyes took in every detail of the restaurant's grandeur, from the crystal chandeliers to the elaborate flower arrangements, with the kind of wonder that only children could feel. The contrast between mother and daughter was striking. Isabella's beauty was refined, polished, perfect. Sophie's was pure and unguarded, the kind of natural charm that made everyone she encountered smile involuntarily. The hostess who approached them was the same woman who had looked at Ryan with barely concealed disdain minutes earlier. But her entire demeanor changed when she recognized Isabella Hart. Her spine straightened. Her smile became genuine, and her voice took on a warmth that had been completely absent during Ryan's arrival. "Miss Hart," she said, her tone carrying just the right balance of respect and familiarity. "How wonderful to see you again. We have your table ready." "Thank you, Margaret," Isabella replied, her voice carrying the kind of casual warmth that suggested she remembered everyone's name and cared enough to use it. "I hope you don't mind that I brought Sophie tonight. I know children aren't typically in the dining room during evening service." The hostess Margaret looked briefly uncomfortable. Meridian had strict policies about children in the main dining room after 6 o'clock. It was one of the things that maintained their exclusive atmosphere, the guarantee that conversations would remain sophisticated and uninterrupted by the chaos that children could bring. But Isabella Hart wasn't just any customer. She was the daughter of William Hart, whose company had catered several major events at the restaurant. More than that, she was exactly the kind of patron that Meridian built its reputation on. Sophisticated, wealthy, and influential enough that accommodating her wishes was always good business. Of course not, Margaret said, though her smile was slightly strained. "We're delighted to have both of you this evening." "Wonderful," Isabella said, but there was steel underneath the silk of her voice, a quiet authority that suggested she had expected no other answer. "Sophie comes everywhere with me. Don't you, sweetheart?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically, then looked up at the hostess with the kind of direct gaze that children specialized in. "Your restaurant is very pretty. Do you have chicken nuggets?" Margaret's professional composure wavered slightly at this question, which was probably the first time anyone had asked about chicken nuggets in Meridian's 50-year history. "I'm sure our chef can prepare something appropriate for young Miss Hart." Sophie beamed. "I like it here already." As Margaret began leading them through the dining room toward Ryan's table, every conversation in the restaurant shifted to accommodate their passage. Men looked up from their wine glasses to admire Isabella's elegance. Women assessed her dress, her jewelry, her shoes. With the kind of detailed evaluation that occurred whenever someone truly striking entered their space. But it wasn't just Isabella's beauty that commanded attention. It was the unmistakable aura of wealth and breeding that surrounded her like expensive perfume. Everyone in the restaurant could sense that she belonged to that rarefied class of people who shaped the world rather than being shaped by it. The whispered conversations that followed in their wake weren't cruel as they had been when Ryan entered. Instead, they were speculative, curious about who Isabella Hart was meeting for dinner and why she had brought her daughter to such an unusual setting. "She must be meeting someone very important," one woman murmured to her dinner companion. "Perhaps a business dinner," suggested another. "Though bringing a child seems odd for that. Maybe it's personal," offered a third voice. "She's been single since her daughter was born. Everyone's been wondering when she'd start dating again." Isabella heard none of these whispered speculations, or if she did, she gave no sign of caring. Her attention was focused entirely on the path ahead, where she could see a man sitting alone at a table in the center of the dining room. Even from across the room, she could tell that Ryan Thompson was exactly what Derek Matthews had promised he would be. Working class, out of his element, dressed in clothes that clearly came from department stores rather than tailors. His posture was rigid with discomfort, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, as if he was afraid of disturbing the precise arrangement of crystal and silverware on his table. But there was something else in his bearing that Derek hadn't mentioned, something that made Isabella slow her pace slightly as she studied him more carefully. Despite his obvious discomfort, despite the fact that he was clearly in a world where he didn't belong, Ryan Thompson hadn't tried to make himself smaller or invisible. He sat straight in his chair, met the stares of other diners with quiet dignity, and carried himself with the kind of honest pride that came from knowing his own worth, even if others didn't recognize it. Isabella's eyes flicked briefly to the corner table, where Derek Matthews sat with his friends. Phones positioned for optimal recording angles, wine glasses raised in anticipatory celebration. She had dealt with Derek's type her entire life. Men who thought wealth was a substitute for character, who believed that inherited privilege made them superior to people who actually worked for their living. The irony of Derek's cruel plan was that he had no idea who he was actually dealing with. Not just Isabella, whose own opinions about class and worth had been shaped by very different experiences than he assumed, and not just Ryan Thompson, who Derek had dismissed as an easy target for humiliation. Derek Matthews was about to learn that some assumptions could be very expensive mistakes. Sophie, meanwhile, was taking in everything around them with the unfiltered enthusiasm of a 3-year-old who had never learned to hide her emotions. She pointed at the chandeliers, whispered excitedly about the flowers on each table, and waved at other diners who smiled back at her infectious joy. But when she spotted Ryan sitting alone at their destination table, something in her expression shifted. Even at 3 years old, Sophie Hart had inherited her mother's ability to read people quickly and accurately. She saw past Ryan's department store clothes and working man's hands to something that resonated with her young but surprisingly wise heart. "Mummy," she said, tugging on Isabella's hand. "Is that him? Is that the man we're having dinner with?" "Yes, sweetheart," Isabella replied, never taking her eyes off Ryan. "That's Ryan Thompson." Sophie studied Ryan for another moment, taking in his gentle eyes, his patient posture, the way he smiled slightly when he noticed her looking at him. Then, with the kind of instant decision that only children could make, she let go of her mother's hand and ran straight toward him. Her little heels clicked on the marble floor like tiny bells, and every person in the restaurant turned to watch this miniature princess charge across the dining room with complete fearlessness. She reached Ryan's table before Isabella could react, before the hostess could intervene, before anyone could stop her. Without hesitation, without shyness, Sophie grabbed Ryan's hand with both of her small ones and looked up at him with the kind of trust that adults had long since learned to be cautious about giving. "Hi," she said, her voice clear and confident. "I'm Sophie. Mommy said we were meeting someone nice today. Are you nice?" The entire restaurant held its breath, waiting to see how this working man would respond to the daughter of one of the city's most powerful families. At the corner table, Derek Matthews leaned forward with his phone, certain that this moment would provide exactly the kind of class clash footage that would make his video go viral. But Ryan Thompson didn't hesitate for even a second. He knelt down to Sophie's level, bringing his eyes to the same height as hers, and smiled with the kind of genuine warmth that couldn't be faked or practiced. "I try to be," he said simply. "Are you nice?" "Very nice," Sophie announced with absolute certainty. "Mommy says being nice is the most important thing, more important than money or fancy clothes or anything." "Your mommy sounds very smart," Ryan replied, and when he looked up to meet Isabella's eyes over Sophie's head, she saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "She is," Sophie said proudly. "She's the smartest in the whole world, and she's really good at business. She has meetings all the time, but she still always has time for me because I'm her favorite person." She leaned in conspiratorially, her voice dropping to what she thought was a whisper, but was actually audible to half the restaurant. "But don't tell anyone. It's a secret." Isabella reached them then, and the moment she had been preparing for during the entire walk across the restaurant finally arrived. She extended her hand to Ryan Thompson, this man who Derek Matthews assumed she would reject without a second thought, and smiled with genuine warmth. "You must be Ryan," she said, her voice carrying just enough of her finishing school training to sound refined without being affected. "I'm Isabella, and I apologize for Sophie's enthusiasm. She doesn't believe in personal space or proper introductions." What Isabella didn't say, what Derek Matthews couldn't possibly have known, was that she had spent the last hour researching Ryan Thompson with the thoroughness of someone who made important business decisions for a living. She knew about his reputation for honest work and fair prices. She knew about the customers whose cars he fixed for free when they couldn't afford to pay. She knew about the community center where he volunteered teaching auto repair skills to teenagers. Most importantly, she knew that Derek Matthews had chosen exactly the wrong person to humiliate and exactly the wrong woman to help him do it. "I like him," Sophie announced to the entire restaurant, her small voice carrying with perfect clarity across the suddenly quiet dining room. "He has kind eyes, and he got down to talk to me properly, instead of just looking down from up there." She gestured vaguely toward the height where most adults existed in her world, then added with the brutal honesty that only 3-year-olds possessed. Most of the men Mommy meets don't like me very much. The words hung in the air like a confession, and Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. It was true, devastatingly so, but she had never expected her daughter to announce it quite so publicly. The men she typically encountered through business or social functions saw Sophie as an inconvenience at best, an obstacle at worst. Ryan was still kneeling at Sophie's eye level, and Isabella watched his expression shift from surprise to something that looked remarkably like anger on her daughter's behalf. "Well, that's their loss," he said firmly, his voice carrying enough conviction that Sophie's face lit up like a Christmas tree. "Any man who doesn't see how lucky your mom is to have you doesn't deserve either one of you." Sophie beamed and threw her arms around Ryan's neck in the kind of spontaneous hug that children gave when they felt completely safe with someone. Over her daughter's shoulder, Isabella saw Derek Matthews lean forward at his corner table, his expression shifting from anticipation to confusion. This wasn't going according to his carefully planned script. The hostess Margaret cleared her throat delicately. "Shall I show you to your table?" Isabella realized they were creating quite a scene, standing in the middle of Meridian's dining room, while every patron watched their interaction with fascination. Sophie was still attached to Ryan like a tiny blonde barnacle, and he seemed perfectly content to let her stay there. "Yes, please," Isabella said. "Sophie, sweetheart, let Ryan stand up so we can sit down." "Do I have to?" Sophie asked, but she released her grip and stepped back. "Can I sit next to him? If Ryan doesn't mind?" Isabella replied, looking at him with a question in her eyes. Ryan straightened his knees, popping slightly from kneeling on the hard floor. "I'd be honored to sit next to Sophie." Margaret led them to the table, which suddenly seemed both too small and too large for this unusual group. Ryan moved to pull out Isabella's chair, a gesture that earned an approving nod from Sophie, who had apparently appointed herself the judge of his manners. "That's good," Sophie informed the restaurant at large. "Mommy says gentlemen always help ladies with their chairs, but most men forget." Ryan helped Sophie into her chair next, boosting her up and adjusting the booster seat that Margaret had quietly provided. His movements were patient and practiced, suggesting he had experience with small children. "Do you have kids?" Sophie asked with her characteristic directness. "No, but I have several customers who bring their children to the shop while I work on their cars. I've learned that little people deserve the same respect as big people." Sophie nodded approvingly. "See, Mommy. He gets it." Isabella settled into her own chair, acutely aware of the attention their table was receiving from the rest of the restaurant. Some diners were frankly staring, fascinated by the unusual sight of the Hart Industries heiress having dinner with a man who clearly didn't belong to their social circle. Others were more discreet, stealing glances while pretending to focus on their own conversations. At Derek's table in the corner, she could see phones positioned for optimal recording angles, 3 men leaning forward with barely contained excitement, waiting for the moment when she would reveal the cruel punchline they expected. Isabella had spent her entire adult life dealing with men who underestimated her intelligence, who assumed that blonde hair and a famous last name meant she could be easily manipulated. Derek Matthews was about to learn exactly how wrong those assumptions could be. But first, she needed to be honest with Ryan Thompson about what was really happening here. "Ryan," she began, folding her hands on the table and meeting his eyes directly. "I need to be completely honest with you about this evening." Ryan's expression didn't change, but she saw his shoulders tense slightly. He was preparing himself for disappointment, for the rejection he had probably expected from the moment he walked into Meridian. "Derek Matthews contacted me last week." Isabella continued, her voice calm and clear. "He told me he was setting up what he called an encounter. He wanted me to come here, meet you, and essentially humiliate you for his entertainment and that of his friends." She nodded toward Derek's table, where 3 men were now leaning forward with obvious interest, phones ready to capture whatever was about to unfold. They planned to film the whole thing and post it on social media. The idea was that I would take one look at you, realize you weren't from my social class, and reject you in the most cruel way possible. Ryan's face flushed deep red, and Isabella saw his hands clench into fists on the table. The humiliation was written clearly across his features, but underneath it she saw something else. Anger, not at her, but at the situation itself. "So why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice tight but controlled. "Why not just do what he wanted? Because Derek Matthews is an idiot who doesn't know nearly as much about me as he thinks he does. Isabella replied, her own anger beginning to show through her composed exterior. He assumed that because I'm the daughter of a CEO, because I wear expensive clothes and attend charity functions, I would naturally find you beneath me and enjoy making you feel small. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Ryan's face. He was wrong about everything. Sophie, who had been listening to this exchange with the intense focus that children brought to adult conversations they didn't quite understand, suddenly spoke up. "Are those the mean men?" she asked, pointing directly at Derek's table. "The ones who wanted to hurt Ryan's feelings?" "Yes, sweetheart," Isabella said softly. "Those are the mean men." Sophie studied Derek's table for a moment with the serious expression she wore when she was thinking hard about something. Then she turned back to Ryan with a look of fierce determination. "Don't worry," she said, patting his hand with her tiny one. "Mommy won't let them be mean to you. She's very good at making mean people sorry." Isabella couldn't help but smile at her daughter's protective instincts. Sophie had inherited more than just her looks from the Hart family line. Ryan was looking between Isabella and Sophie with an expression that suggested he was still processing what he'd been told. The relief of knowing he wasn't going to be humiliated was warring with the anger of knowing that had been the plan all along. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "If you knew this was supposed to be a cruel prank, why did you come? Why not just tell Derek to get lost?" "Several reasons," Isabella replied. "First, I was curious about the man Derek had chosen as his target. I did some research on you, Ryan Thompson. I know about Morrison's auto repair, about how you took over your uncle's business and kept all his employees, even though downsizing would have been more profitable. I know about your reputation for honest work and fair prices. I know how you fixed Mrs. Chen's car for free when you found out she was choosing between paying you and buying groceries." Ryan's eyebrows rose. "How did you find all that out?" "I have my methods," Isabella said with a slight smile. "The point is, Derek chose you because he thought you'd be an easy target for humiliation. What he didn't realize is that he was actually introducing me to exactly the kind of man I've been hoping to meet." "Really?" The word came out softer than Ryan had intended, carrying more hope than he'd meant to reveal. "Really," Isabella confirmed. "Ryan, I get asked out constantly by men who see my last name and think dollar signs, men who drive cars that cost more than most people's houses and say all the right things but treat service staff like they're invisible and see my daughter as an inconvenience to be managed." "That's true," Sophie chimed in. "There was this one man, what was his name again?" "Mommy Brad Kensington," Isabella said with obvious distaste. "Right," Sophie turned to Ryan with the air of someone sharing important intelligence. "He said children should be seen and not heard, so I told him that was stupid and that he shouldn't be seen or heard either." Ryan couldn't help but laugh at Sophie's matter-of-fact delivery. "You told him that?" "Yep," Sophie said proudly. "Mommy said it wasn't polite, but Grandpa said it was accurate." Isabella's smile was both proud and slightly embarrassed. Sophie is very protective of her opinions about people. She's also remarkably good at reading character. "Like how she knew you were nice right away," Sophie said to Ryan. "I can always tell. The mean ones look at me like I'm a problem. The nice ones look at me like I'm a person." Her simple wisdom hit Ryan harder than any complex explanation could have. This 3-year-old had articulated something profound about human nature, with the clarity that only children possessed. "You sound like a very smart judge of character," he told Sophie. "I am," she agreed without false modesty. "And I like you. You're not fake like the other ones." From across the restaurant, Derek's voice carried over the ambient noise, sharp with frustration. "What the hell is taking so long?" She was supposed to shut this down by now. Isabella's expression hardened as she glanced toward Derek's table. "Those men think they understand how the world works," she said quietly. "They think wealth automatically creates superiority, that accidents of birth determine worth. They're about to learn that some assumptions can be very expensive mistakes." Ryan found himself studying Isabella's face, seeing past the obvious beauty to the intelligence and strength underneath. This wasn't the shallow materialistic woman Derek had expected her to be. This was someone with depth, complexity, and apparently a protective streak when it came to people she cared about. And somehow, impossibly, she seemed to be including him in that category. "So what happens now?" Ryan asked. "When we leave here, I mean." "They're obviously going to post things online, probably." "Let them try, Isabella," said with quiet confidence. "Derek Matthews has no idea who he's actually dealing with. Neither do his friends." She reached across the table and covered Ryan's hand with hers, the gesture simple but electric. "They planned this evening to teach you a lesson about staying in your place," she said softly. "Instead, I think they're about to learn a very different lesson entirely." But before Isabella could explain further, their waiter approached the table. He was impeccably dressed in the restaurant's signature black uniform, his movements practiced and professional. His name tag read James, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had served Meridian's elite clientele for many years. "Good evening," James said, his voice warm but respectful. "Miss Hart, it's lovely to see you again. And this must be Sophie." Sophie beamed up at him. "Hi, James. Do you remember me?" "Of course I do. You're the young lady who asked me about the chandelier last time you were here. It's very sparkly," Sophie informed Ryan seriously. "James told me it has 200 crystals on it. I counted, but I only got to 17 before I got dizzy." James smiled genuinely at Sophie's explanation, then turned his attention to Ryan. "And you must be Mr. Thompson. Welcome to Meridian. Can I start you with something to drink this evening?" Ryan glanced at the wine list that James offered, and his heart sank. The cheapest bottle cost more than he typically spent on groceries for 2 weeks. He was about to ask for water when Isabella smoothly intervened. "We'll have the Domaine Chandon," Isabella said. "The 2018 vintage if you have it available. And Sophie will have her usual sparkling apple cider in a champagne flute." "Of course," James replied. "And would you like to hear about tonight's specials?" As James described dishes with names Ryan couldn't pronounce and ingredients he'd never heard of, Ryan found himself studying Isabella more carefully. She listened to the specials with genuine interest, asked intelligent questions about preparation methods, and seemed completely at ease in this world of white tablecloths and crystal glasses. But there was something else underneath her polished exterior. A warmth and authenticity that Derek Matthews had completely missed in his calculations. When James finished describing the specials, Isabella turned to Ryan. "What sounds good to you? And please don't worry about the prices. This is my treat." "I can't let you pay for dinner," Ryan protested, though the relief in his voice was obvious. "Yes, you can," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "Mommy always pays when she invites people. It's good manners." Isabella smiled at her daughter's confident assertion. "Sophie's right. I invited you, so I'm buying. Besides, Derek was planning to pay for this evening as part of his little show. The least I can do is make sure his credit card actually gets some use." "How do you know Derek will pay?" Ryan asked. "Because I'm about to text him and tell him that if he doesn't pick up the bill for this dinner, along with a generous tip for James, I'll make some phone calls that will ensure his investment firm loses several very important clients." She pulled out her phone and began typing with swift efficiency. "Men like Derek think wealth is just about having money. They don't understand that real wealth is about having influence, and influence means knowing which phone calls to make when someone needs to be taught a lesson." As Isabella sent her message, Ryan watched Derek's table from the corner of his eye. He saw Derek check his phone, saw his expression shift from confident amusement to something approaching panic as he read Isabella's text. Derek immediately began typing back, his fingers moving frantically across his phone screen. Within moments, Isabella's phone chimed with his response. "Let's see what Derek has to say," Isabella murmured, opening his message. She read it silently, then looked up at Ryan with a smile that was both beautiful and slightly predatory. "He says he'd be delighted to cover our evening and that he hopes we have a lovely time." Sophie clapped her hands together. "Does that mean the mean men can't be mean anymore? It means they're starting to understand that being mean has consequences," Isabella replied, reaching over to smooth Sophie's hair. "Especially when you're mean to people I care about." The casual way she said it, the implication that she already cared about Ryan after knowing him for less than an hour, made something warm unfurl in his chest. When was the last time someone had stood up for him? When had anyone ever used their influence to protect him instead of diminish him? James returned with their drinks, the champagne properly chilled and poured with ceremony. Sophie's apple cider presented in a crystal flute that made her giggle with delight. After they ordered their meals, the conversation began to flow more naturally. "Tell me about your business," Isabella said, settling back in her chair. "How long have you been running Morrison's?" 3 years since Uncle Pete died, Ryan replied. "He owned it for 22 years before that. I grew up in that shop, learning everything from him. He always said that honest work and fair prices would build a reputation worth having." "That's exactly the kind of philosophy my father started with," Isabella said thoughtfully. "He always told me that your reputation is the only thing you truly own. Everything else can be taken away." "What does your father do?" Ryan asked, then immediately felt foolish. Everyone in the city knew who William Hart was. "He runs Hart Industries," Sophie answered before her mother could respond. "He builds big buildings and helps people with money stuff, and he gives lots of money to help sick kids get better." Isabella smiled at her daughter's simplified but accurate description. "My father started Hart Industries 35 years ago with $1,000 he borrowed from his own uncle. He was the son of a maintenance worker at a downtown office building. Every night after school, he'd go to work with his father, learning how buildings worked from the ground up." Ryan's eyebrows rose. "I didn't know that. The articles I've read about Hart Industries always focus on the business empire, not the background." "That's intentional," Isabella said. "In business, people often respect you more if they think you were born into success rather than built it yourself. It's easier to intimidate competitors if they think wealth and power come naturally to you." "But that's not true," Sophie added. "Grandpa says money doesn't make people good or bad. People make money good or bad." "Your grandfather sounds very wise," Ryan said. "He is. He also said that people who work with their hands build the world that everyone else gets to live in." Sophie looked directly at Ryan as she said this, her young face serious. "Grandpa would like you." The sincerity in Sophie's voice, the matter-of-fact way she delivered what was clearly a carefully remembered lesson from her grandfather, made Ryan feel something he hadn't experienced in years. Acceptance. Not just tolerance or politeness, but genuine acceptance from people whose opinions mattered. "Does your father know you're here tonight?" Ryan asked Isabella. "Does he know about Derek's plan?" Isabella's smile turned mysterious. "My father knows everything that's important. Let's just say that Derek Matthews may find Monday morning at work very interesting." Their meals arrived then, beautifully presented dishes that looked more like art than food. Sophie had insisted on the chicken tender specially prepared by the chef, while Isabella and Ryan had ordered fish that came with sauces Ryan couldn't identify, but tasted better than anything he'd ever eaten. As they ate, the conversation continued to flow with surprising ease. Isabella talked about growing up in her father's shadow, about learning business principles at the dinner table, about the pressure and privilege that came with the Hart name. "People assume that having money makes everything easy," she said, cutting her fish into precise bites. "And in many ways it does. I've never worried about paying bills or finding a job. But it also means that everyone wants something from you. Every friendship, every relationship becomes complicated by questions of motivation." "How do you know who's genuine?" Ryan asked. "You learn to read people quickly," Isabella replied. "You develop instincts about who sees you as a person versus who sees you as a bank account or a business opportunity. And you treasure the people who treat you normally, who aren't impressed by your last name or intimidated by your money." "Like Ryan," Sophie announced. "He didn't even know who we were when I hugged him. He just thought I was a nice little girl." "That's because you are a nice little girl," Ryan said seriously. "Probably the nicest I've ever met." Sophie beamed at the compliment, then launched into an elaborate story about her preschool teacher and a classroom hamster named Mr. Whiskers. As she talked, gesturing enthusiastically with her small hands, Ryan found himself completely charmed by her unfiltered joy and enthusiasm. Isabella watched Ryan's interaction with her daughter with growing amazement. Most of the men she encountered tolerated Sophie, at best treated her like an obstacle to be managed, while they pursued Isabella's attention and money. But Ryan was genuinely engaged with Sophie, listening to her stories with the same attention he'd given to Isabella's business discussions. "She's not usually this talkative with strangers," Isabella said softly, while Sophie paused to take a drink of her sparkling cider. "I don't think she sees me as a stranger," Ryan replied, watching Sophie arrange her vegetables into what appeared to be a garden on her plate. Children are good judges of character. They don't have all the filters that adults develop. That's true, Isabella agreed. Sophie has never warmed up to anyone this quickly. Usually it takes weeks for her to feel comfortable enough to chatter like this. Maybe it's because I'm not trying to impress her, Ryan said thoughtfully. I'm not trying to win her approval so I can get closer to you. I just think she's a remarkable little person who deserves to be heard. The simple honesty of his statement hit Isabella harder than any practiced charm could have. This was exactly what had been missing from every other relationship she'd attempted since Sophie was born. Men who saw her daughter as a person rather than a complication. As if sensing the importance of the moment, Sophie looked up from her vegetable garden and studied both adults with the intense focus she reserved for important decisions. Are you going to be friends? She asked directly. Because I think you should be friends. You both smile with your eyes when you talk to each other. Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. Her 3-year-old daughter had apparently inherited the Hart family ability to read people and situations with uncomfortable accuracy. I'd like to be friends, Ryan said, simply looking at Isabella rather than Sophie. If Isabella would like that too. I would, Isabella replied, her voice softer than she'd intended. I really would. Good, Sophie said with satisfaction. Now can we order dessert? James said they have chocolate cake that's taller than me. As James presented the dessert menu with elaborate descriptions of artistic confections, Ryan found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't experienced since before Sarah left. The conversation flowed naturally, moving from serious topics to shared laughter as Sophie provided running commentary on everything around them. Isabella was nothing like the shallow, materialistic woman Derek had expected her to be. She was intelligent, thoughtful, and surprisingly down-to-earth, despite her obvious sophistication. More importantly, she treated him like an equal rather than a curiosity or a charity case. The chocolate cake, when it arrived, was indeed taller than Sophie and decorated with spun sugar that looked like art. Sophie's eyes widened to cartoon proportions as James set it in front of her. That's the most beautiful cake in the whole world, she breathed, then looked up at Ryan with complete seriousness. You have to help me eat it. It's too important for one person. As they shared dessert, Isabella found herself studying Ryan's face in the candlelight. His hands, calloused and permanently stained from years of honest work, were gentle as he helped Sophie navigate her enormous slice of cake. His laugh was genuine when Sophie got chocolate frosting on her nose. His attention to her daughter never felt forced or calculated. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it, not another wealthy bachelor with impeccable credentials and empty charm. But a man who saw her daughter as a blessing rather than a burden, who valued character over connections, who treated service staff with respect and didn't need to name-drop or show off to feel important. Derek Matthews, in his cruel attempt to humiliate a decent man, had accidentally introduced Isabella to exactly the kind of person she'd hoped to find. As the evening wound down and James brought the check, Isabella discreetly handled the payment, while Sophie dozed in her chair, exhausted by excitement and chocolate. Ryan started to protest again, but Isabella silenced him with a look. This was my choice, she said firmly. Derek planned to pay for a humiliation. Instead, he got to pay for one of the most enjoyable evenings I've had in years. So what happens now? Ryan asked the same question he'd posed earlier, but with a different tone. Hope had replaced resignation in his voice. Now, Isabella said, gathering her purse and gently waking Sophie, we exchange phone numbers and plan to see each other again. Soon. Tomorrow, Sophie asked, instantly alert despite her previous drowsiness. Let's start with a phone call. Isabella laughed. But yes, very soon. As they prepared to leave, Isabella glanced toward Derek's table in the corner. The 3 men were slumped in their chairs like deflated balloons, their phones put away, their expressions ranging from confused to worried. Derek's evening of cruel entertainment had become his own expensive lesson in underestimating people, and based on the text messages Isabella had been receiving from her father during dinner, Derek's education was just beginning. But that was a problem for Monday morning. Tonight was about new beginnings, unexpected connections, and the discovery that sometimes the people who try to hurt you end up giving you exactly what you needed most. As they walked toward the restaurant exit, Sophie, holding both Ryan's hand and Isabella's Isabella, realized that Derek Matthews had no idea what he'd actually accomplished tonight. He'd set out to humiliate a good man, and instead had introduced that man to the family who would change his life forever. The valet brought Ryan's truck around, and Isabella watched his face carefully as he tipped the young man and helped them into the vehicle. There was no embarrassment about his 10-year-old pickup, no apology for the manual windows or the small tear in the passenger seat. This was who he was, and he wasn't ashamed of it. As Ryan drove them to Isabella's car, Sophie chatted excitedly from the middle of the bench seat about their evening. She'd had chocolate cake taller than herself, met a nice man who listened to her stories, and spent an evening in a restaurant with chandeliers that sparkled like diamonds. For Sophie, it had been a perfect night. For Isabella, it had been a revelation. And for Ryan, it had been the beginning of understanding that maybe, just maybe, he was enough exactly as he was. Derek's cruel plan had backfired in ways he couldn't possibly have imagined. Instead of proving that people should stay in their designated social classes, he'd demonstrated that real connection transcended artificial boundaries. As they pulled into the parking lot where Isabella's BMW waited, Sophie was already making plans for their next meeting. Ryan helped Isabella transfer her daughter's car seat, their hands brushing as they worked together to secure the straps. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and the recognition of something worth pursuing. "I had a wonderful time tonight," Isabella said softly. "Both of us did." "So did I," Ryan replied. "More wonderful than I expected when this evening started." Sophie, now buckled into her car seat in Isabella's car, called through the open window. "Ryan, will you come to my birthday party? It's in 3 weeks and Mommy always makes the best cake. If your mommy invites me, I'd be honored to come," Ryan said, making Sophie squeal with delight. "Consider yourself invited," Isabella said, her smile warm and genuine. "And Ryan, thank you for being exactly who you are. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like that's not enough." As Isabella drove away with Sophie waving enthusiastically from the back seat, Ryan stood in the parking lot and watched their taillights disappear into the night. His phone buzzed with a new text message. It was from Isabella. "Thank you for a perfect evening. Call me tomorrow." Ryan saved her number in his phone and typed back, "Wild horses couldn't stop me." As he drove home through the quiet city streets, Ryan reflected on how completely his life had changed in the span of a single evening. He'd walked into Meridian expecting humiliation and found something he'd stopped believing was possible. Hope. Meanwhile, across town in his penthouse apartment, Derek Matthews was pacing his living room like a caged animal. His phone had been ringing constantly since dinner. Ended text messages arriving from business contacts, social connections, and professional acquaintances. The messages all carried variations of the same theme. William Hart was asking questions about Derek's character and judgment. Hart Industries was reconsidering their business relationship with Kensington Financial. Perhaps Derek should consider whether his current position was a good fit for someone with his demonstrated lack of professional discretion. Derek's friends Trevor and Austin had left hours ago, suddenly remembering other commitments when it became clear that their evening of entertainment had become a networking nightmare. The video footage they'd planned to use for social media humiliation was now nothing more than evidence of their own cruelty. As Derek poured himself another drink and tried to calculate how much tonight's entertainment was going to cost him professionally, he still didn't understand what had gone wrong. He'd chosen Ryan Thompson as a target because he seemed like an easy mark, a working-class mechanic who would be out of his depth at a place like Meridian, easily intimidated and humiliated by someone from Isabella Hart's social class. He'd assumed Isabella would share his casual cruelty, would see Ryan as beneath her, and react with predictable disdain. Derek had been wrong about everything. Ryan Thompson wasn't weak or easily intimidated. He was a man of quiet strength and genuine character. Exactly the kind of person who impressed people like William Hart, who had built his own empire from similar humble beginnings. Isabella Hart wasn't the shallow, materialistic woman Derek had expected. She was intelligent, principled, and perfectly capable of recognizing character when she saw it. Most importantly, Derek had underestimated the power of genuine connection over artificial social boundaries. As his phone buzzed with another ominous message from a business contact, Derek Matthews began to realize that some assumptions could be very expensive mistakes. Sunday morning arrived with autumn sunshine streaming through the windows of Ryan's apartment. For the first time in 18 months, he woke up with something to look forward to. Isabella had said to call her today, and Sophie had extracted a promise that he'd come to her birthday party. Ryan made coffee and sat at his kitchen table with his phone in his hand, nervous about making the call, but excited in a way he'd forgotten was possible. At exactly 10 o'clock, he dialed Isabella's number. She answered on the second ring. "Good morning, Ryan. I was hoping you'd call early. Sophie's been asking about you since she woke up." "Good morning, Isabella. How did she sleep after all that chocolate cake like a rock? But she dreamed about chandeliers and chocolate cake taller than buildings. She wants to know if you'd like to come to the park with us this afternoon. Nothing fancy, just the playground and maybe ice cream." "I'd love that," Ryan said, meaning every word. That afternoon, Ryan found himself pushing Sophie on the swings at Riverside Park, while Isabella sat on a nearby bench, watching them with a smile that made his chest feel tight with happiness. Sophie had insisted that Ryan needed to see how high she could swing, and she provided running commentary on her aerial achievements. "Look how high I'm going," she called out, her blonde curls streaming behind her like ribbons. "I'm almost flying." "You are flying," Ryan called back. "You're the best flyer I've ever seen." Isabella watched this interaction with growing amazement. Sophie had accepted Ryan into their lives with the instant trust that children reserved for people they felt truly safe with. And Ryan responded to Sophie's enthusiasm with genuine enjoyment rather than adult tolerance. When Sophie finally tired of swinging and demanded ice cream, they walked to the vendor cart near the pond. Ryan insisted on paying this time, despite Isabella's protests, counting out exact change for 3 ice cream bars with the careful attention of someone who knew the value of every dollar. As they sat on a bench eating their ice cream, Sophie between them with chocolate dripping down her chin. Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced since Sophie was born. Contentment. Not the careful satisfaction of a successful business deal or the polite pleasure of social obligations, but the deep, warm contentment of being exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right people. "Ryan," she said, as Sophie ran off to chase ducks by the pond. "I need you to understand something." He turned to look at her, his expression attentive and slightly concerned. "Last night at dinner, Sophie said you were nice because you got down to her level to talk to her, but that's not the only reason she likes you." "What do you mean?" Isabella watched her daughter bend down to examine something fascinating in the grass. Sophie has never had a father figure in her life. Her biological father left before she was born, and every man I've dated since then has seen her as an obstacle to overcome rather than a person to appreciate. Ryan was quiet, listening with the same focused attention he'd given to Sophie's stories the night before. "Sophie doesn't remember life without me, but she knows something's missing. She sees her friends with their fathers and asks me why she doesn't have one. I've always told her that our family is complete with just the 2 of us, that we don't need anyone else to be happy. But watching her with you yesterday, seeing how naturally you interact with her, I realized I might have been wrong about that." Isabella's voice grew softer. "I wasn't looking for a father for Sophie when I agreed to meet you. I was curious about the man Derek had chosen to humiliate, and I wanted to turn his cruel plan against him. But watching you 2 together, seeing how happy you make her just by treating her like she matters," she paused, gathering her courage for what she wanted to say next. "I think Sophie's been waiting for someone like you without even knowing it. And honestly, so have I." Ryan felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Isabella, I need you to know that I don't see Sophie as something to tolerate or work around. She's remarkable. She's funny and smart and honest in ways that most adults have forgotten how to be. Spending time with both of you yesterday was the best evening I've had in years." He watched Sophie squat down to examine a particularly interesting leaf, her small face scrunched in concentration. "I lost my wife 18 months ago. She left because she said I wasn't enough, that I couldn't give her the life she deserved. For a year and a half I believed that. I thought maybe I was just meant to be alone, that someone like me didn't deserve a family. But watching Sophie yesterday, listening to her laugh, having her trust me enough to hold my hand and share her stories, it reminded me that maybe I do have something to offer. Maybe being enough isn't about money or status. Maybe it's about showing up, being present, caring about the people in your life. Isabella reached over and took his hand. Ryan Thompson. You are more than enough. You're exactly what Sophie and I have been missing without knowing it. Sophie chose that moment to run back to them. Her cheeks flushed with excitement and her hands cupped around something precious. Look what I found, she announced, opening her palms to reveal a smooth, heart-shaped stone. It's a treasure, and I found it while you two were talking about important things. She looked between them with the knowing expression that children sometimes wore when they understood more than adults gave them credit for. Are you going to be my friend forever, Ryan? She asked with the directness that only 3-year-olds could manage. If that's what you want. Ryan said seriously, I'd like that very much. It is what I want, Sophie declared. And Mommy wants it too. She gets happy eyes when she talks about you. Isabella laughed, embarrassed but pleased by her daughter's observation. Happy eyes, very happy eyes, Sophie confirmed. Like when you look at me, but different. More like when you look at chocolate cake. Both adults burst into laughter at Sophie's comparison, and the little girl beamed with pride at making them happy. As the afternoon wore on, they walked around the park, Sophie running ahead to investigate every interesting tree, flower, and squirrel, while Ryan and Isabella talked about everything and nothing. The conversation flowed with the same easy naturalness they'd discovered the night before, but now it was deepened by honesty and the recognition of genuine connection. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they found themselves back at the bench where they'd eaten ice cream hours earlier. Sophie had finally worn herself out and was curled up between them, her head on Isabella's lap and her legs across Ryan's knees, fast asleep, despite the outdoor setting. She trusts you completely, Isabella said softly, smoothing Sophie's hair. She's never fallen asleep like this around anyone except me. Ryan looked down at Sophie's peaceful face, her small hand still clutching the heart-shaped stone she'd found. I can't remember the last time I felt this. Content, he said quietly. Like everything in the world was exactly as it should be. Isabella studied his profile in the golden evening light. This man who had been chosen as a target for cruelty had instead become the answer to prayers she hadn't known she was praying. Monday morning would bring the real world back to them. Derek Matthews would face the consequences of his actions. Isabella would return to her responsibilities at Hart Industries, and Ryan would go back to Morrison's auto repair. But for now, in this moment, they were exactly where they belonged. Monday morning arrived like a storm front, and Derek Matthews was about to discover that some lessons came with a very high price. Derek's alarm clock had been ringing for 5 minutes before he finally rolled over and turned it off. His head was pounding from too much wine and too little sleep, and his mouth tasted like regret mixed with expensive alcohol. He'd spent most of Sunday fielding phone calls from increasingly nervous business associates, all of them asking careful questions about his judgment and professional discretion. By evening, the pattern had become clear. William Hart was asking questions, and when William Hart asked questions about someone's character, smart people paid attention. Derek forced himself out of bed and into the shower, trying to wash away the growing certainty that Friday night's entertainment was going to cost him more than the dinner bill. As the hot water pounded against his back, he tried to figure out how to explain to his boss that a practical joke had somehow turned into a professional nightmare. The commute to Kensington Financial took Derek through the heart of downtown, past glass towers that housed the city's most powerful companies. Hart Industries occupied an entire building near the financial district, its logo visible from Derek's office window as a daily reminder of the kind of success that demanded respect. Derek had always been proud of his corner office, his expensive suits, his reputation as someone who got things done without worrying too much about whose feelings got hurt in the process. Today, those things felt fragile, as if they could disappear with a phone call from the wrong person. At exactly 9 o'clock, Derek's assistant knocked on his office door with the kind of expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. "There's Matthews, Mr. Kensington would like to see you in his office immediately." Richard Kensington was the founder and CEO of Kensington Financial, a man who had built his investment firm from nothing and had very strong opinions about what kind of behavior reflected well on his company. He was also Derek, suddenly remembered with growing alarm, a long-time golf partner of William Hart. Derek straightened his tie and walked down the hallway to the executive suite, his footsteps echoing on marble floors that suddenly seemed less impressive and more ominous. Kensington's office was a study in understated power. Rich wood paneling, leather-bound books, awards, and photographs documenting 30 years of financial success. Kensington himself sat behind a desk that could have been an aircraft carrier, his expression unreadable but definitely not friendly. "Sit down," Derek Kensington said without preamble. "We need to talk." Derek sat trying to project confidence, while his stomach churned with anxiety. "I had an interesting conversation this morning with William Hart," Kensington continued. "He was asking about your character, your judgment, your fitness to represent this company in professional settings." The words hit Derek like physical blows. William Hart had been asking questions about him personally. This wasn't just about business relationships or investment deals. This was about his reputation, his career, his future. "He seemed particularly interested in your activities last Friday evening," Kensington went on. "Something about a restaurant, a practical joke, an attempt to humiliate someone for entertainment purposes." Derek opened his mouth to defend himself, to explain that it had just been harmless fun, that no one had actually been hurt. But the words died in his throat when he saw the expression on Kensington's face. "Derek, in the 30 years I've been running this company, I've learned that character matters more than credentials. Our clients trust us with their money, their futures, their legacies. They need to believe that the people representing Kensington Financial are individuals of integrity and sound judgment." Kensington stood up and walked to the window overlooking the financial district. "In all that time, I've never had William Hart call me to express concerns about one of my employees' personal conduct. William Hart is one of the most respected businessmen in this city. When he questions someone's character, people listen." The older man turned back to face Derek, his expression grave. "Effective immediately. You're on administrative leave pending a full review of your conduct and your fitness to continue representing this company. Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings." Derek felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Administrative leave was corporate speak for career suicide. Once word got out that Kensington Financial had suspended him pending a character review, no other investment firm in the city would touch him. "Mr. Kensington, I can explain. It was just a joke. Nobody actually got hurt." "Derek, the problem isn't what you did. The problem is that you thought it was appropriate to do it. That tells me everything I need to know about your judgment and your character." Kensington pressed a button on his phone. "Security, please escort Mr. Matthews to his office, and then off the premises." As Derek was walked through the office by two security guards past colleagues who suddenly became very interested in their computer screens, he finally understood what Isabella had meant when she'd talked about influence and phone calls. Derek Matthews had learned that some entertainment was too expensive to afford. Meanwhile, across town at Morrison's Auto Repair, Ryan was discovering that his life was about to change in ways he'd never imagined. He was underneath a Honda Civic wrestling with a stubborn oil filter when he heard the shop's bell chime, indicating someone had entered. Ryan called out from under the car, his voice slightly muffled by the engine above him. "Be right with you. Just finishing up here. Take your time," a voice replied. "I'm in no hurry." There was something familiar about the voice, but Ryan couldn't place it until he rolled out from under the Honda and found himself looking up at a man in an expensive suit who somehow managed to make even the garage setting look comfortable rather than out of place. William Hart stood in the middle of Morrison's Auto Repair like he belonged there, his hands clasped behind his back as he examined the neat organization of tools, the clean work areas, the pride that showed in every detail of Ryan's shop. "Mr. Hart," Ryan said quickly, wiping his hands on a rag and standing up. "This is unexpected. Is there something wrong with your car?" William smiled, and Ryan saw where Isabella had gotten her warmth. "Not with my car, no. I wanted to meet the man who made such an impression on my daughter and granddaughter this weekend." Ryan felt heat rise in his cheeks. "They're remarkable people, sir. I enjoyed spending time with them very much. So I understand." William walked slowly around the garage, his experienced eyes taking in the quality of Ryan's work, the respect he showed for his tools, the obvious care he took with his customers' property. Isabella told me about Derek Matthews' little plan to humiliate you. She also told me how you handled yourself throughout the evening. Ryan wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he remained quiet, letting William Hart set the pace of the conversation. Do you know anything about my background, Ryan? Not much beyond the fact that you built Hart Industries into something impressive. William stopped next to Uncle Pete's old workbench, running his fingers along the worn wooden surface. My father was a maintenance supervisor in a downtown office building. Every day after school, I'd go to work with him, learning how buildings worked from the foundation up. I learned the value of honest work and fair treatment from a man who never made more than $30,000 in a single year. He turned to look directly at Ryan. But I also learned that success isn't measured by what you make, it's measured by what you build, and how you treat people while you're building it. Ryan found himself thinking of Uncle Pete, who had taught him similar lessons in this very garage. Isabella told me you took over this business when your uncle passed away, William continued. That you kept all his employees, even though downsizing would have been more profitable. That you've built a reputation for honest work and fair prices. That's what Uncle Pete taught me, Ryan said simply. He always said that your reputation is the only thing you really own. Smart man. William walked over to look at the framed photo of Uncle Pete standing next to the restored Mustang. Isabella also told me that you treat my granddaughter like she matters, not like an inconvenience to be managed while you pursue her mother. Sophie's an amazing little girl, Ryan said. Any man who sees her as anything other than a blessing doesn't deserve to be in Isabella's life. William nodded approvingly. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to Ryan. Hart Industries has a fleet of vehicles that need regular maintenance. Trucks, company cars, construction equipment. We currently contract that work out to 3 different shops, none of which provide the kind of personal service that builds long-term relationships. Ryan looked at the business card, then back at William Hart. I'm flattered, sir, but I'm not sure my shop is big enough to handle that kind of contract. Then maybe it's time to expand, William said with a slight smile. I didn't build Hart Industries by playing it safe, Ryan. I built it by recognizing opportunity and having the courage to take calculated risks. He gestured around the garage. You have the foundation here. Good reputation, quality work, honest dealings. What you need is capital to grow, to hire good people, to expand your capacity. William Hart was offering him the opportunity of a lifetime, and Ryan felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Why, he asked honestly. Why would you take that kind of risk on someone you just met? Because my daughter and granddaughter are excellent judges of character, William replied. Because Derek Matthews chose you as a target for humiliation, which tells me you're exactly the kind of person worth knowing. And because 35 years ago, someone took a chance on a maintenance worker's son who had big dreams and no money. Ryan stared at the business card in his hands. Hart Industries logo printed in elegant lettering, a phone number that could change everything. I don't know what to say, he admitted. Say you'll think about it, William suggested. Say you'll let me know by Friday whether you're interested in a partnership that could benefit both of us. A partnership Hart Industries provides the capital for expansion. You provide the expertise and management. We split the profits according to a formula that recognizes both contributions. William extended his hand to Ryan. Think it over. Talk to Isabella about it. But remember that opportunities like this don't come along very often. As they shook hands, Ryan felt like his entire world was shifting beneath his feet. 3 days ago, he'd been a struggling mechanic, barely making ends meet. Now he was being offered a partnership with one of the city's most successful companies. Mr. Hart, Ryan said, as William prepared to leave. Thank you for believing in me, for giving me this chance, for raising an incredible daughter and granddaughter. William smiled. Thank you for reminding me that character still matters more than credentials. Isabella and Sophie deserve someone who sees them for who they are, not what they represent. That evening, Ryan called Isabella with news that left both of them amazed and slightly overwhelmed by how quickly their lives were changing. He offered you a partnership. Isabella's voice carried wonder and excitement. Ryan, do you understand what this means? I think so, Ryan said, though he was still trying to process the day's events. Your father is offering me the chance to build something bigger than I ever imagined possible. He's offering you the chance to become the man you've always been capable of being. Isabella corrected gently. My father sees potential that others miss. That's how he built his empire, by recognizing value where others see only surface appearances. Do you think I should take it? Isabella was quiet for a moment, and Ryan could almost hear her thinking through the implications. I think you should do what feels right to you, she said finally. But I also think my father doesn't make offers like this lightly. If he believes in you, maybe it's time you started believing in yourself. That night, Ryan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Uncle Pete and the lessons he'd learned in this garage. About Sarah's letter and the pain of being told he wasn't enough. About Isabella and Sophie and the possibility of a family he'd never dared to hope for. About William Hart's offer and the chance to build something that would honor Uncle Pete's memory while creating a legacy for the future. By morning, he'd made his decision. 6 months later, Thompson Hart Automotive occupied a building 3 times the size of the original Morrison's shop, with 8 experienced mechanics, state-of-the-art equipment, and a waiting list of customers who had heard about their reputation for quality work and honest dealing. Ryan stood in his office looking out at the bustling garage floor where men and women he'd hired worked with the same pride and attention to detail that Uncle Pete had taught him. On his desk sat a framed photo of the original Morrison's shop. Uncle Pete's gentle smile, a daily reminder of the values that had built this success. The phone on his desk rang, and Isabella's voice filled the room with warmth. Are you ready for tonight? She asked. As ready as a man can be for the most important question of his life, Ryan replied. Sophie's been practicing her job as ring bearer all morning. Isabella laughed. She's very serious about her responsibilities. Tonight, Ryan would ask Isabella to marry him. The ring was already in his pocket, a simple but elegant diamond that he'd chosen with Sophie's help 3 weeks ago. They'd spent an hour at the jewelry store while Sophie examined every ring with the focused attention of a professional consultant. That one she'd finally announced, pointing to the ring that had immediately caught Ryan's eye as well. It's perfect for Mummy because it's beautiful, but not too fancy. She doesn't like fancy things that much. The saleswoman had smiled at Sophie's confident assessment, and Ryan had known immediately that his 3-year-old consultant was absolutely right. The proposal would take place at Riverside Park at the same bench where they'd eaten ice cream on their first afternoon together. Isabella thought they were going for an ordinary Sunday picnic, but Ryan had spent weeks planning every detail. Sophie was in charge of bringing the heart-shaped stone she'd found that first day, which she'd been carrying in her pocket like a talisman ever since. William Hart would be hiding behind a tree with a camera ready to capture the moment when his daughter realized what was happening. The past 6 months had transformed all their lives in ways none of them could have anticipated. Thompson Hart Automotive was thriving beyond Ryan's wildest dreams. Isabella had taken on a more active role at Hart Industries, working closely with her father to ensure their partnership with Ryan's company continued to benefit both businesses. Most importantly, they'd become a family in all but legal terms. Ryan spent most evenings at Isabella's house, helping Sophie with her bedtime routine, reading stories and marveling at how naturally he'd slipped into the role of father figure that Sophie had been waiting for her entire short life. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Learning to merge their different worlds, their different backgrounds, their different expectations had required patience and compromise from everyone involved. But love, Ryan had discovered, made those challenges feel like adventures rather than obstacles. Derek Matthews, meanwhile, had learned that actions had consequences. His suspension from Kensington Financial had become permanent termination when the character review revealed a pattern of questionable judgment and unprofessional behavior. No other investment firm in the city would hire him, and he'd eventually been forced to leave town and start over somewhere his reputation couldn't follow him. Trevor and Austin had faced their own professional consequences as word of their Friday evening entertainment spread through their social circles. It turned out that cruelty, even when disguised as humor, wasn't as amusing to others as they'd believed. But Derek's failure had become Ryan's opportunity, and sometimes justice worked in unexpected ways. As Sunday afternoon arrived, Ryan drove to Isabella's house with his heart hammering and the ring box making his pocket feel impossibly heavy. Sophie met him at the door, practically bouncing with excitement about their picnic plans. She had no idea she was about to help orchestrate the most important moment of all their lives. At the park, as they spread their picnic blanket on the grass near the pond, Ryan watched Isabella laugh at something Sophie said, and felt his chest tighten with overwhelming love. This woman, this child, this life they'd built together, it was everything he'd never known he wanted, and more than he'd ever believed he deserved. When the moment came when Sophie handed him the heart-shaped stone with a solemn expression, and Isabella looked at him with sudden understanding, Ryan dropped to one knee and asked the question that would determine their future. "Isabella Hart, will you marry me?" Through her tears, through Sophie's excited squealing, through the sound of William Hart's camera clicking from his hiding place behind the oak tree, Isabella's answer rang clear and certain. Yes, Ryan Thompson, yes, yes, yes. They were married 3 months later in the same park where they'd shared their first afternoon together, where they'd fallen in love gradually, and then all at once, where they'd learned that family wasn't about where you came from, but about who you chose to love. Sophie served as flower girl and ring bearer, taking both jobs seriously and executing them with the focused determination she brought to everything important in her life. William Hart walked his daughter down the aisle, his eyes bright with tears, and his heart full of gratitude for the man who had brought such joy to his family. Uncle Pete's photo sat in a place of honor at the reception, watching over the celebration of love that had grown from the foundation he'd helped Ryan build. As Ryan and Isabella danced their first dance as husband and wife, with Sophie standing beside them, holding both their hands, they reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them together. Derek Matthews had meant to prove that some people should know their place, that social boundaries were walls that couldn't be crossed. Instead, he'd demonstrated that real love transcended artificial barriers, that character mattered more than credentials, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories grew from the most unlikely beginnings. Thompson Hart Automotive continued to thrive, employing dozens of people and serving hundreds of customers who valued honest work and fair treatment. Isabella took on greater responsibilities at Hart Industries, while Ryan built his business with the same values Uncle Pete had taught him. Most importantly, Sophie Thompson now had the father she'd been waiting for her entire life, a man who saw her not as an obligation or an obstacle, but as the remarkable little person she'd always been. Some stories end with justice. Others end with love. The best ones, like this one, end with both. Friends, if this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, if it reminded you that kindness still matters and that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, please don't just listen and forget. Hit that like button to show your support for stories that restore faith in humanity. Subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales that prove good people still exist in this world. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that our worst moments don't define us, but how we choose to treat others always does. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time when someone's kindness changed your life, or when you had the chance to show kindness to a stranger. Your stories matter, and you never know whose day you might brighten by sharing them. Remember, real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts. It's measured in the lives we touch, the love we share, and the character we build one choice at a time. Thanks for being part of our community, where every story matters and every heart has value. Until next time, keep believing in the power of unexpected kindness and second chance.